The master of mankind has sat immobile upon the golden throne for over 10,000 years, his broken body sustained by ancient technology that grows more unstable with each passing century. What transpired aboard the vengeful spirit during the final confrontation of the Horus heresy left wounds so catastrophic that even a being of the Emperor's immense power could not regenerate from them. The duel between father and son represents the single most devastating moment in Imperial history, and its consequences continue to define the Imperium's struggle for survival in the 41st millennium. When the Emperor teleported aboard Horus's flagship, he knew the confrontation would determine humanity's fate. The Warmaster had become something far beyond a corrupted Primarch. The combined essence of all four Chaos gods flowed through him, transforming Horus into a vessel of unprecedented demonic power. The Emperor found his favored son in the ship's command throne room, and what followed was a battle that tore at the fabric of reality itself. Horus wielded the Talon of Horus, the lightning claws that had been reforged and empowered by the ruinous powers, each strike carrying warp-born energies capable of annihilating souls. The Emperor held back during the initial exchanges, still hoping to reach whatever remained of Horus beneath the Chaos corruption. This hesitation proved nearly fatal. The Warmaster's attacks landed with devastating effect, each blow channeling power drawn directly from the warp. The Talon's claws pierced the Emperor's golden armor and tore into his flesh, but the true damage went far deeper. The Chaos-empowered strikes didn't merely wound the physical form, they shattered portions of the Emperor's essence, creating injuries that existed simultaneously in the material realm and the Imperium. When a trooper attempted to intervene and was obliterated instantly by Horus, the Emperor finally recognized that his son was irretrievably lost. Only then did he unleash his full psychic might, destroying Horus so completely that even his soul was annihilated. The victory came at an unthinkable cost. The Emperor's body had been ravaged beyond any hope of natural recovery. His spine was shattered, organs ruptured, and vast portions of his physical form simply ceased to function. More critically, the psychic damage inflicted by Horus's chaos-infused attacks had created wounds in the Emperor's very essence that would not heal. Rogel Dorn found his father barely clinging to existence and brought him back to the Imperial Palace on Terra. The Emperor's instructions were clear. He must be interred within the Golden Throne, the ancient device originally designed during the Great Crusade for an entirely different purpose. The Golden Throne itself predates the Horus heresy, constructed during the Emperor's secret webway project beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor had intended to use the device as a psychic interface to control and stabilize humanity's entrance into the webway, the ancient Eldari network that allowed faster-than-light travel without the dangers of warp transit. When Magnus the Red's ill-fated psychic warning about Horus's betrayal shattered the protective wards around the webway portal, demons poured through the breach. The Emperor spent the remaining years of the heresy seated upon the throne, holding back the demonic tide while his sons fought the civil war above. After his confrontation with Horus, the throne became his prison and life support system simultaneously. The device functions on principles that blend advanced Dark Age technology with psychic amplification mechanisms that even the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot fully comprehend. Its primary function now serves to sustain the Emperor's failing biological processes, while simultaneously channeling his immense psychic power to maintain the Astronomican. This psychic beacon shines through the warp from Terra, allowing navigators throughout the galaxy to plot courses for warp travel. Without the Astronomican, the Imperium would fragment into isolated systems within weeks, unable to coordinate military responses or maintain trade routes across the vast distances of the galaxy. The throne's secondary function involves sealing the Imperial webway breach beneath the palace. This aspect of its operation remains one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets. The Emperor's psychic might continues to hold shut a portal that would otherwise flood Terra with demonic entities. The Adeptus Custodes maintains a permanent garrison in the webway tunnels below the palace, fighting an endless war against chaos forces that still probe the Emperor's psychic barriers for weaknesses. Maintaining both functions requires a horrific sacrifice that defines the Imperium's brutal pragmatism. The Golden Throne consumes psychic energy at a rate that even the Emperor's vast power cannot sustain alone in his damaged state. The Adeptus Astronomica, working under the direction of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, selects approximately 1,000 psychers daily from the Black Ship's tides. These psychers are brought before the Golden Throne, and their life force is drained to feed the device and sustain the Emperor. The process is absolute. The psychers are consumed entirely, their souls burned away to provide the necessary psychic energy. This sacrifice has continued every single day for over 10 millennia, representing billions of psychers who have died to keep the Emperor alive and the Astronomican burning. The throne itself shows increasing signs of failure. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests, who maintain the device, report that components are breaking down at an accelerating rate. Many parts cannot be replaced because the knowledge to manufacture them has been lost since the dark age of technology. The Fabricator General of Mars considers the throne's eventual failure inevitable, though estimates for when this might occur vary wildly from centuries to mere decades. Each malfunction requires increasingly desperate measures to repair, and several times in recent imperial history, the throne has come perilously close to complete shutdown. The political ramifications of this knowledge remain so severe that only the highest echelons of the Imperium's leadership understand the full extent of the crisis. The Emperor's consciousness exists in a state that defies conventional understanding. His psychic presence remains detectable to those with the sensitivity to perceive it, but whether this represents a unified awareness or something more fragmented remains a subject of intense debate among those few individuals with knowledge of such matters. Custodians who stand guard in the throne room report sensing vast psychic activity emanating from the Emperor, though they cannot determine if he remains consciously aware in any meaningful sense. Some describe impressions of immense concentration, as though the Emperor's entire being focuses on maintaining the Astronomican and holding the webway breach closed, leaving no capacity for other awareness. Within the warp itself, the Emperor's presence manifests as a blazing beacon of psychic power that rivals the chaos gods themselves in intensity. This manifestation engages in constant conflict with the entities of the Imperium, fighting battles on a scale incomprehensible to mortal minds. Whether this represents the Emperor's conscious action or an automatic defense mechanism generated by his psychic might remain unknown. Some theorists within the Inquisition's most radical factions propose that the Emperor's consciousness has fragmented across multiple levels of reality, with portions of his awareness operating independently in both the Materium and Immaterium. The Adeptus Custodes maintains absolute control over access to the throne room, with only the Captain General of the Custodes and the highest-ranking members of the Adeptus Ministorum permitted to approach the Emperor directly. The 10,000 have observed their master's condition for millennia, and their records contain observations that would shake the foundations of the Imperial Creed if they became public knowledge. These records remain sealed within the most secure vaults of the Imperial Palace, protected by layers of security that make the archives effectively impregnable. Even High Lords of Terra cannot access this information without the explicit permission of the Captain General. The question of what happens if the Emperor's physical form finally expires has generated numerous theological and metaphysical theories within the hidden circles of the Inquisition, the Adeptus Custodes, and the most radical elements of the ecclesiarchy. Among these theories, none has proven more persistent or controversial than the Star Child concept, a doctrine that emerged during the earliest days of the Imperium and continues to influence certain fringe beliefs despite its dubious canonical status within official imperial theology. The Star Child theory originates from fragments of information dating back to the Rogue Trader era, when the Imperium's structure remained less rigidly defined than in the current age. According to this doctrine, the Emperor possesses the ability to father offspring who inherit a portion of his immortality and psychic potential. These individuals, known as the Sensei, supposedly exist scattered throughout the galaxy, unaware of their true heritage. Unlike normal humans, the Sensei do not age and possess an innate resistance to chaos corruption that stems from their divine lineage. The theory proposes that these beings carry fragments of the Emperor's uncorrupted essence, portions of his soul that exist independent of his current state upon the Golden Throne. The theological implications of the sensei concept challenge fundamental aspects of the Imperial Creed. The Ecclesiarchy teaches that the Emperor represents a singular, perfect being whose divinity transcends human reproduction. The suggestion that he fathered children during his time walking among humanity introduces complexities that most members of the Adeptus Ministorum find heretical. Yet the theory persists in certain circles, particularly among those who seek alternatives to the Imperium's current trajectory towards slow extinction. The sensei themselves, if they exist, would represent living repositories of the Emperor's original nature, the aspects of his being that existed before his internment upon the throne and his subsequent deification by the masses of humanity. Connected to the sensei theory exists an even more secretive organization, allegedly known as the Illuminati. This cabal supposedly consists of individuals who have been possessed by demons and subsequently freed themselves through sheer force of will, emerging from the experience with an understanding of chaos that transcends normal human comprehension. The Illuminati, according to the theory, have spent millennia searching for the sensei and gathering them for a specific purpose. Their ultimate goal involves bringing these scattered offspring together at the moment of the Emperor's physical death, allowing their combined essence to merge with his departing soul. This fusion would theoretically enable the Emperor's rebirth as the Star Child, a new god of order untainted by the accumulated spiritual weight of 10,000 years of worship, suffering, and psychic strain. The Star Child doctrine proposes that this reborn Emperor would emerge as a true god within the warp, possessing the full measure of his original power combined with genuine divinity achieved through the faith of countless billions. Unlike his current state, where his consciousness remains divided between maintaining the Astronomican, holding the webway breach closed, and fighting the chaos gods in the Imperium, the Star Child would exist as a unified entity capable of acting with purpose and intent. This reborn god would theoretically possess the power to challenge the ruinous powers directly, potentially reshaping the balance of power within the warp itself. The practical problems with this theory are numerous and severe. First, the existence of the sensei remains unverified by any reliable imperial authority. No confirmed sightings exist within official records, and the Inquisition has found no concrete evidence supporting their existence despite occasional investigations into the matter. Second, even if the sensei exist and could be gathered, the process of merging their essence with the Emperor's departing soul assumes a level of metaphysical control that may not be achievable. The warp operates according to principles that defy rational prediction, and attempting to engineer a divine rebirth through such means could just as easily result in catastrophic failure or corruption by chaos entities waiting to exploit the moment of transition. More credible than the Star Child theory, at least among those who study the Emperor's current condition, is the concept of soul fragmentation. The Emperor's psychic presence exists simultaneously across multiple planes of reality. His physical body remains trapped within the Golden Throne, sustained by technology and the daily sacrifice of psychers. His consciousness, however, appears to operate on several distinct levels. Within the Materium, some portion of his awareness maintains the Astronomican and holds the webway breach sealed. Within the Imperium, his psychic presence manifests as a vast entity that battles the chaos gods and their demonic servants. Some theorists propose that additional fragments of his consciousness exist in states or locations that remain entirely unknown to imperial authorities. This fragmentation may not represent damage or weakness, but rather an intentional strategy. The Emperor's understanding of the warp exceeded that of any other human being who has ever lived, with the possible exception of Magnus, the Red, before his fall to Tzeentch. It remains entirely plausible that the Emperor deliberately distributed aspects of his consciousness across multiple levels of reality as a defensive measure, ensuring that no single catastrophic event could destroy him entirely. Each fragment would operate with some degree of autonomy, pursuing objectives that serve his overall strategy, even if those fragments cannot communicate directly with each other. The implications of this fragmentation become particularly significant when considering the Emperor's growing divine nature. For 10,000 years, quadrillions of human beings across 1,000,000 worlds have offered prayers, devotion, and faith to the Master of mankind. The ecclesiarchy has transformed the Emperor from a secular leader who rejected religious worship into the central figure of the largest organized religion in galactic history. Every prayer spoken in his name, every act of faith performed by his followers, every martyr who dies calling upon his protection, all of this generates psychic energy that flows into the warp and accumulates around the Emperor's presence within the Imperium. The Chaos Gods themselves achieved their existence through similar mechanisms. Khorne coalesced from the rage and violence of sentient beings, Nurgle from their despair and desire for survival, Tzeentch from their ambition and scheming, and Slaanesh from the Eldari civilization's descent into depravity and excess. The Emperor's growing presence within the warp follows this same pattern of apotheosis through belief and worship. The faith of the Imperium's masses feeds his power, transforming him from a supremely powerful psyker into something approaching a true god of order, humanity's answer to the ruinous powers. This process of deification occurs independent of the Emperor's physical state. His body withers upon the Golden Throne, but his presence in the warp grows stronger with each passing century. The question that haunts the Imperium's most knowledgeable authorities concerns whether this transformation could achieve completion, while the Emperor's consciousness remains divided between the Materium and Immaterium. Some theorists propose that the Emperor's physical death would prove necessary to complete his apotheosis, releasing the portions of his consciousness currently bound to maintaining the Astronomican and sealing the webway breach, allowing his full awareness to consolidate within the warp as a unified divine entity. The immediate consequences of the Emperor's physical death, however, would prove catastrophic beyond measure. The Golden Throne maintains two critical functions that cannot simply cease without triggering galaxy-spanning disasters. The Astronomican's failure would leave the Imperium blind, unable to navigate the warp safely. Within weeks, the Imperium would fragment into isolated sectors, each cut off from central authority and unable to coordinate defense against the countless threats that assail humanity from all sides. The Imperium would not collapse immediately, but its coherence as a unified political entity would effectively end. The second consequence involves the webway breach beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's psychic might have held this portal sealed for 10 millennia, preventing demonic entities from flooding directly into the heart of the Imperium. His death would release this barrier instantly. The resulting warp breach would make the original incident caused by Magnus the Red seem trivial by comparison. Demons would pour through the portal in numbers that would overwhelm even the Adeptus Custodes and the defenses of the Imperial Palace. Terror itself would become the epicenter of a warp storm that would consume the entire Sol system and potentially spread far beyond. The psychic shockwave generated by the Emperor's death would propagate through the warp like a tsunami, felt by every psyker in the galaxy simultaneously. The death of a being whose psychic presence rivals the Chaos Gods themselves would create disturbances in the Immaterium on a scale that defies calculation. Some projections suggest that the resulting warp storm could rival or exceed the Great Rift that tore the galaxy in half during the 42nd millennium. Terra would become a demon world, the cradle of humanity transformed into a nightmare realm where reality and the warp merge completely. Yet within this catastrophe lies the possibility of transformation. If the Emperor's consciousness successfully consolidates within the warp at the moment of his physical death, and if the accumulated faith of 10,000 years has genuinely elevated him to true godhood, then his emergence as a unified divine entity could fundamentally alter the balance of power within the Immaterium. A god of order born from humanity's collective faith and the Emperor's own vast power would represent the first genuine challenge to the Chaos God's dominance of the warp since Slaanesh's birth destroyed the Eldari Empire. The nature of this reborn emperor remains pure speculation. Would he retain the personality and memories of the being who walked among humanity during the Great Crusade, or would deification transform him into something entirely different? The Chaos Gods themselves possess distinct personalities and motivations, but they also represent vast, inhuman forces that transcend individual consciousness. The Emperor's transformation might follow a similar pattern, creating a god who embodies humanity's drive for survival, order, and dominance, but who no longer thinks or acts in ways recognizable as human. The return of Roboute Guilliman to the Imperium in the early 42nd millennium shattered assumptions that had stood unchallenged for 10,000 years. The 13th Primarch of the Ultramarines had lain in stasis since his wounding by the demon Primarch Fulgrim during the Horus Heresy's aftermath, his throat cut by the poisoned blade of the anatheme. The wound refused to heal despite the Primarch's superhuman regenerative abilities, forcing his sons to place him within a stasis field where time effectively stopped. For millennia, Guilliman remained frozen at the moment of his death, displayed within the Temple of Correction on Macragge as both shrine and monument to the Imperium's lost glory. The circumstances of his revival began with the 13th Black Crusade and Abaddon the Despoiler's successful destruction of the Cadian Gate. As chaos forces poured through the widening warp rifts and the galaxy began tearing itself apart, an unlikely alliance formed between the Ultramarines and the Inari, a faction of Eldari who followed Ivrain, the prophet of the newly awakened god Ennead. The Inari possessed one of the Crone Swords of Vol, ancient weapons of immense power scattered across the galaxy and the warp. Ivrain claimed she could use the sword called Kavur to heal the Primarch's wound, but the process required reaching Macragge through a galaxy descending into anarchy. The journey to the Ultramarines' homeworld tested the fragile alliance between human and Xenos forces. Archmagos Belisarius Call accompanied the expedition, bringing with him the Armor of Fate, a suit of artificer armor he had spent millennia perfecting specifically for Guilliman's eventual return. Call's presence indicated that certain elements within the Mechanicus had anticipated this moment, suggesting planning that stretched back thousands of years. The Archmagos had worked in secret, following instructions he claimed came from Guilliman himself before the Primarch's wounding, though the nature of these instructions and their true origin remained subjects of intense speculation. When Ivrain finally stood before Guilliman's stasis preserved form in the Temple of Correction, the ritual she performed drew upon powers that horrified the Ultramarines who witnessed it. The Cronesword Kavur channeled energies from Ennead, the Eldari god of the dead that existed in a state of partial awakening. The sword pierced Guilliman's chest, and Ivrain channeled power through it that operated on principles entirely foreign to human understanding. The wound in the Primarch's throat closed. The poison that had prevented healing for 10,000 years burned away by energies that existed at the intersection of life and death. Guilliman's heart restarted, his lungs drew breath, and the stasis field collapsed as time resumed its hold on the Primarch's body. The revival itself proved that even beings as far beyond normal humans as the Primarchs could be restored from states that appeared irreversibly fatal. Guilliman had existed for millennia in a condition that any other being would consider death, his body preserved only by stasis technology, his wound actively preventing any natural recovery. Yet the application of sufficient power, channeled through appropriate means, reversed damage that had persisted for 10,000 years. The implications extended far beyond a single Primarch's return. If Guilliman could be healed after so long, what other restorations might prove possible given the right combination of knowledge, technology, and power? Call's immediate actions following the revival demonstrated the depth of preparation involved. The Armor of Fate incorporated technologies that pushed the boundaries of what the Mechanicus officially acknowledged as possible. The suit systems integrated seamlessly with Guilliman's physiology, providing enhanced protection and capabilities beyond even the legendary armor the Primarchs had worn during the Great Crusade. Call also revealed the existence of the Primaris Space Marines, a project he claimed to have pursued for 10 millennia under Guilliman's original orders. These enhanced Astartes represented a fundamental advancement in the Emperor's original work, incorporating genetic modifications and additional organs that made them superior to standard Space Marines in nearly every measurable way. The Primaris Project's existence proved that the genetic knowledge the Emperor had used to create the Space Marines and Primarchs had not been entirely lost. Kage had somehow preserved, studied, and built upon this information, achieving advances that the Imperium had assumed impossible after the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne. The Archmagos had worked with samples of the Primarch's genetic material, refining and improving upon the original template. If such work could be accomplished with the Primarch's gene seed, questions arose about what might be possible with access to the Emperor's own genetic material and the advanced technologies that sustained him upon the Golden Throne. Guilliman's journey to Terra following his revival brought him face to face with the Imperium he had helped create, now transformed into something he barely recognized. The secular imperial truth he had fought to establish had been completely supplanted by the imperial creed, which deified his father as a god. The ecclesiarchy wielded enormous political power, commanding resources and authority that Guilliman found disturbing. The administratum had calcified into a bureaucratic nightmare where decisions took decades to implement. The Inquisition operated with unchecked authority, declaring entire worlds heretical and ordering their destruction on the judgment of single individuals. Everything about the Imperium's current state contradicted the vision Guilliman remembered from the Great Crusade. The Primarch's meeting with his father in the throne room represented a moment of profound significance and horror. Guilliman entered the chamber expecting to find the Emperor he remembered, the being who had created him, who had led the Great Crusade with vision and purpose, who had represented humanity's best hope for a rational, enlightened future. What he encountered instead shook him to his core. The Emperor's communication, when it came, felt cold and alien, lacking any trace of the paternal warmth or human connection Guilliman remembered. The being that spoke to him seemed to regard the Primarch as a tool, a useful instrument to be deployed in the ongoing struggle for humanity's survival, but nothing more. Guilliman's own accounts of this meeting, shared only with his closest advisors, described a presence that felt utterly inhuman. Whether this represented a genuine change in the Emperor's nature, a result of 10,000 years of suffering and deification, or whether it revealed something about the Emperor that had always existed beneath the surface, Guilliman could not determine. The Primarch left the throne room with his faith in his father fundamentally shaken, questioning whether the being he served still possessed any meaningful connection to the leader he had known during the Great Crusade. The theological implications of this encounter remained carefully suppressed. The ecclesiarchy could not be allowed to learn that a returned Primarch harbored doubts about the Emperor's divine nature. Guilliman recognized that the imperial creed, despite his personal distaste for it, served a vital function in maintaining the Imperium's cohesion. Billions of humans across 1 million worlds drew strength from their faith, and that faith generated real power in the form of phenomena like the living saints, and the protection prayers seemed to offer against demonic corruption. Dismantling the ecclesiarchy's authority would create chaos that the Imperium could not survive in its current weakened state. Yet Guilliman's return immediately triggered political conflicts that demonstrated what the Emperor's own return might unleash on a far larger scale. The Primarch claimed authority as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, a title he had held during the Great Crusade and which technically had never been revoked. This position placed him above even the High Lords of Terra in the imperial hierarchy. The existing power structures resisted this assertion, with various factions attempting to limit Guilliman's authority or manipulate him for their own purposes. The ecclesiarch particularly opposed the Primarch's secular outlook and his barely concealed contempt for the imperial creed. Guilliman's reforms began immediately despite this resistance. He reorganized the High Lords of Terra, removing those he judged incompetent or corrupt and installing individuals he believed would serve the Imperium more effectively. He launched the Indomitus Crusade, deploying the new Primaris Space Marines across the galaxy to reinforce beleaguered Imperial forces. He attempted to streamline the administratum's bureaucratic processes and improve coordination between the Imperium's various military forces. Every reform met resistance from entrenched interests that had operated unchallenged for millennia. The Primarch's experience with the Mechanicus proved particularly relevant to questions about the Emperor's potential restoration. Kal had demonstrated capabilities that the mainstream Mechanicus considered borderline heretical. His work on the Primaris project required him to innovate and experiment rather than simply maintaining existing technology according to established ritual. The Archmagos had preserved knowledge that supposedly had been lost, suggesting that the Mechanicus's claims about the irretrievability of Dark Age technology might be overstated. If Kal could accomplish such work in secret over 10,000 years, what might be possible with the full resources of Mars directed toward a single goal? The Golden Throne's maintenance represented the Mechanicus's highest priority, yet their approach remained fundamentally conservative. Tech priests treated the device as a holy relic, performing repairs according to ancient protocols, without fully understanding the principles involved. Kal's methods suggested an alternative approach, studying the throne's mechanisms with the goal of genuine comprehension rather than rote maintenance. Such study might reveal options for the Emperor's restoration that the Mechanicus's traditional methods could never discover. Guilliman's return also demonstrated that beings who had been absent from the Imperium for millennia could reintegrate and assume positions of authority, though not without significant friction. The Primarch possessed legitimacy that even the most powerful High Lords could not match. He was the Emperor's son, a living connection to the Imperium's founding. Yet this legitimacy did not translate into automatic obedience or smooth implementation of his will. Every order faced resistance. Every reform required political maneuvering and compromise. The Imperium had developed its own momentum over 10,000 years, and changing its direction proved enormously difficult even for a Primarch. The implications for the Emperor's potential return became clear through observing Guilliman's struggles. A restored Emperor would possess ultimate legitimacy, but he would also face an Imperium that had evolved in his absence into something he might not recognize or approve. The ecclesiarchy would face an existential crisis if their god walked among them as a physical being who contradicted their doctrine. The High Lords would lose all meaningful authority. The Inquisition's independence would end. Every power structure in the Imperium would face potential dissolution or fundamental reorganization. The political upheaval would make Guilliman's conflicts with the existing order seem trivial by comparison. Yet Guilliman's revival also proved that the Imperium could survive such upheaval. The institutions bent rather than breaking, accommodating the Primarch's authority while maintaining their essential functions. The Imperium possessed a resilience born of 10,000 years of surviving every conceivable catastrophe. It had endured Black Crusades, wars, Tyrannid hive fleets, and countless other threats. The return of its founder, while unprecedented, would not necessarily destroy the structures that had developed in his absence. Those structures might transform, but transformation differed from collapse. The precedent Guilliman's awakening extended beyond politics to the realm of what remained physically possible. The Primarch had been restored through a combination of Zeno's power, ancient technology, and careful preparation spanning millennia. His recovery demonstrated that even the most severe damage could be reversed given sufficient resources and knowledge. The Emperor's injuries exceeded Guilliman's in severity by orders of magnitude, but the principle remained the same. What had been done for a Primarch might, theoretically, be achieved for the master of mankind himself. The Emperor's true nature as an immortal being predates the Imperium by millennia, and understanding his capacity for survival, or potential resurrection, requires examining the broader phenomenon of perpetuals within the Warhammer 40,000 universe. These individuals represent a rare mutation or evolutionary quirk that grants them functional immortality through reincarnation. When a perpetual dies, regardless of the manner of death, their consciousness and physical form reconstitute over time. This process differs fundamentally from the Emperor's current state upon the Golden Throne, where his body remains technically alive but catastrophically damaged, raising questions about whether his perpetual nature still functions beneath the layers of injury and the Golden Throne's intervention. The most extensively documented perpetual in Imperial records is Alanius' person, though his story has been obscured by millennia of myth and deliberate obfuscation. Alanius lived for tens of thousands of years, witnessing the rise and fall of countless human civilizations. He served as a soldier in multiple armies across different eras, from ancient Earth's early wars through to the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade itself. His perpetual nature meant he experienced death numerous times throughout his existence, only to return to life after each instance. The process was neither instantaneous nor comfortable. Accounts suggest that perpetual resurrection could take days or weeks, depending on the severity of the fatal injuries, and the experience of dying and returning left psychological scars that accumulated over millennia. During the Horus Heresy, Alanius served as a guardsman in the Imperial army, having deliberately chosen obscurity rather than leveraging his ancient knowledge for personal gain. His presence aboard the Vengeful Spirit during the final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus has been documented in various sources, though the exact nature of his intervention remains disputed. Some accounts describe him interposing himself between the Emperor and Horus at a critical moment, buying the Emperor precious seconds to unleash his full power against the War Master. Whether this intervention proved decisive or merely symbolic, Alanius died in that throne room, obliterated by chaos-infused energies that may have destroyed him so completely that even his perpetual nature could not trigger resurrection. John Grammaticus represents another confirmed perpetual whose existence intersects with the Emperor's plans during the Great Crusade and Heresy. Grammaticus possessed abilities beyond simple immortality. He demonstrated powerful psychic talents and an aptitude for languages that allowed him to master any tongue within hours of exposure. The Cabal, a Xenos organization dedicated to combating chaos, recruited Grammaticus and used him as an agent in their schemes to manipulate the outcome of the Horus Heresy. His perpetual nature made him an ideal operative for long-term missions, though the psychological burden of his immortality weighed heavily on him. Grammaticus eventually turned against the Cabal's plans, recognizing that their proposed solution to chaos, allowing Horus to win and trigger humanity's extinction, represented a cure worse than the disease. Olivia Shorka's connection to the Emperor proved more direct and personal than other perpetuals. She served the Emperor during the Unification Wars and into the Great Crusade, acting as one of his agents in various capacities. The Emperor granted her additional powers beyond her natural perpetual abilities, marking her with psychic wards and enhancements that allowed her to operate in environments that would destroy normal humans. Shurka eventually settled on the world of Malech, where she maintained a hidden shrine that concealed one of the Emperor's greatest secrets, a portal to a realm within the warp where he had bargained with the Chaos Gods themselves to obtain the knowledge necessary to create the Primarchs. Her presence there as a guardian demonstrated the Emperor's trust in her loyalty and capabilities, though she ultimately aided individuals who opposed his plans during the heresy. Daemon Prytanes remains among the more mysterious perpetuals, with fewer confirmed details about his activities and relationship to the Emperor. What records exist suggest he operated during the Age of Strife and into the early Imperium, though his ultimate fate remains unclear. The scarcity of information about Prytanes reflects a broader pattern. Many perpetuals deliberately avoided historical documentation, recognizing that immortality attracted unwanted attention from both human authorities and darker forces. The Emperor himself maintained secrecy about his nature for most of human history, walking among ordinary people without revealing his true age or capabilities. The Primarch Vulcan represents a unique case among the Emperor's sons. Unlike his brothers, Vulcan inherited a form of perpetual immortality from the Emperor's genetic engineering. This ability manifested differently than natural perpetuals. Vulcan's resurrections occurred more rapidly, and his body could recover from injuries that would leave normal perpetuals dead for extended periods. During the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords captured Vulcan and subjected him to systematic torture and execution, killing him repeatedly in attempts to break his spirit. Each time, the Primarch returned to life, demonstrating resilience that horrified even the traitors. His perpetual nature proved that the Emperor possessed sufficient understanding of this phenomenon to deliberately engineer it into one of his creations, suggesting he might have the knowledge to manipulate or restore such abilities if circumstances permitted. The Emperor's own origins as a perpetual have been described in various sources, though the accounts contain inconsistencies that may reflect either incomplete information or deliberate mythologizing. The most prevalent narrative describes his creation through a mass ritual suicide performed by shamans in ancient Anatolia around 8000 BCE, though some sources place this event even earlier. These shamans were psykers who could reincarnate after death, essentially functioning as perpetuals themselves. They foresaw a time when the warp's corruption would make their individual reincarnations impossible, as demons would consume their souls before they could return to physical form. Their solution involved gathering together and simultaneously ending their own lives, merging thousands of psychic souls into a single Gestalt consciousness that would possess power sufficient to resist chaos corruption across multiple lifetimes. This narrative, if accurate, suggests the Emperor represents something fundamentally different from natural perpetuals like Alanius or Grammaticus. Rather than a single immortal consciousness experiencing sequential lives, the Emperor would be a composite being formed from thousands of merged souls. This origin would explain his immense psychic power, not merely the strength of one powerful psyker, but the accumulated might of an entire generation of humanity's most gifted individuals. It would also provide context for his seemingly inhuman perspective, as Gilliman and others have noted. A being formed from thousands of merged consciousnesses might not think or feel in ways recognizable as individually human, even if he retained understanding of human nature from the memories and experiences of his component souls. The question of whether this merging process could be replicated or reversed remains purely theoretical. No evidence suggests anyone has attempted to recreate the shaman's ritual in the 40 millennia since the Emperor's creation. The process would require gathering hundreds or thousands of powerful psykers willing to sacrifice themselves, and coordinating their simultaneous deaths in a manner that would merge rather than simply destroy their souls. The Imperium sacrifices 1,000 psykers daily to feed the Golden Throne, but these deaths serve to provide raw psychic energy rather than creating any form of merged consciousness. The knowledge of how the ancient shamans achieved their fusion may have died with them, preserved only in whatever memories the Emperor retains from that distant era. Erda's revelation in recent lore added another layer to understanding the Emperor's nature and the creation of the Primarchs. She identified herself as the Emperor's former collaborator and the genetic co-creator of the Primarchs, referred to in some sources as their mother in a genetic sense, though not through any conventional biological process. Erda herself was a perpetual who had lived for thousands of years, and her partnership with the Emperor during the Primarch project gave her intimate knowledge of his methods and goals. The genetic material that formed the Primarchs came from both the Emperor and Erda, blending their contributions through processes that combined advanced genetic engineering with warp-based manipulation. Erda's betrayal of the Emperor's plans proved catastrophic. She scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy while they were still gestating in their incubation pods, believing she was saving them from a fate she considered worse than the risks of separation. Her knowledge of the Emperor's true intentions suggested he planned to use the Primarchs as weapons in a campaign that would ultimately sacrifice their humanity for strategic necessity. Whether her assessment was accurate or represented a misunderstanding of the Emperor's complex, multi-layered plans remains debatable. What is clear is that her actions directly enabled the Chaos Gods to corrupt several Primarchs during their formative years, leading to the Horus Heresy and the Emperor's eventual internment upon the Golden Throne. Erda's existence as a perpetual who worked closely with the Emperor for extended periods provides crucial context for understanding his own immortality. She witnessed his methods, his manipulation of both genetic material and warp energies, and his long-term planning across timescales that would exhaust normal human comprehension. Her eventual disillusionment with his goals suggests the Emperor's plans involved elements that even another perpetual with millennia of experience found disturbing. After scattering the Primarchs, Erda went into hiding, using her knowledge of the Emperor's methods to conceal herself from his awareness for 10,000 years. This successful concealment from a being of the Emperor's vast psychic power demonstrates that perpetuals possess capabilities for evading detection that go beyond simple immortality. The theoretical implications of the Emperor's perpetual nature for his potential resurrection center on whether that fundamental aspect of his being remains intact beneath his injuries. Natural perpetuals resurrect automatically after death, their consciousness and physical form reconstituting without external intervention. The Emperor's current state complicates this process in multiple ways. First, he is not technically dead. His body continues to function, sustained by the Golden Throne and the daily sacrifice of psychers. The perpetual resurrection mechanism might only trigger upon actual death, meaning his current sustained state could prevent the natural cycle from activating. Second, the nature of the Emperor's injuries goes beyond physical damage. Horus wielded chaos-empowered weapons that struck at the Emperor's essence across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. These wounds exist in both the materium and the immaterium, creating damage that might interfere with the resurrection process that works for other perpetuals. A normal perpetual who suffers physical death can reconstitute their body because their consciousness remains intact within the warp during the transition. The Emperor's psychic presence is already active within the warp, fighting continuous battles against the chaos gods. This division of his consciousness between maintaining the Astronomican, holding the webway breach sealed, and combating chaos entities might mean there is no unified consciousness available to trigger resurrection in the conventional perpetual manner. Third, the Emperor's deification over 10,000 years has fundamentally altered his nature. The faith of quadrillions of humans has poured psychic energy into his presence within the warp, transforming him from a supremely powerful perpetual psyker into something approaching a true god. This transformation might have overridden or subsumed his original perpetual nature. Gods within the warp do not die and resurrect in the manner of perpetuals. They exist as vast, semi-permanent presences that can be diminished but not easily destroyed. If the Emperor has genuinely achieved godhood through accumulated faith, his perpetual nature might have become irrelevant, replaced by divine existence that operates according to entirely different principles. The Golden Throne itself represents the final complication. The device maintains the Emperor's physical body in a state between life and death, while simultaneously channeling his psychic power to serve the Imperium's needs. This artificial intervention might actively prevent the natural perpetual resurrection cycle from initiating. If the Emperor's physical body were to die while still connected to the throne, the device's mechanisms might attempt to sustain him anyway, creating a paradoxical state where he is dead but cannot progress to resurrection because the throne refuses to release him. Alternatively, the throne's failure might release him to die properly, finally allowing his perpetual nature to activate after 10,000 years of suppression. The experiences of other perpetuals suggest that resurrection time correlates with the severity of fatal injuries. A lanius person could return from ordinary deaths within days, but more catastrophic destruction required longer periods. The Emperor's injuries represent the most severe damage ever inflicted on a perpetual, combining physical destruction with psychic wounds that span multiple planes of reality. If his perpetual nature remains functional and could activate upon true death, the resurrection process might require centuries or millennia rather than the days or weeks other perpetuals experience. The Imperium would need to survive without him during this period, facing all the catastrophic consequences of the Golden Throne's failure and the Astronomican's extinction. The Golden Throne's origins trace back to the Dark Age of technology, that lost era when humanity reached heights of scientific achievement that make the Imperium's current capabilities seem primitive by comparison. The device predates the Emperor's modifications by thousands of years, though its original purpose remains a subject of intense speculation among those few tech priests with access to the most restricted archives on Mars. Some fragmentary records suggest it functioned as a control mechanism for psychic manipulation on a massive scale, possibly related to humanity's early experiments with warp-based technology before the Age of Strife taught brutal lessons about such hubris. Other theories propose it served as a throne for an ancient human psyker king whose civilization has been completely forgotten, or as a mechanism for stabilizing localized warp phenomena during humanity's expansion across the stars. What is certain is that the Emperor discovered or acquired the device at some point during the Unification Wars or the early Great Crusade. He recognized its potential for his most ambitious project, the creation of a human-controlled pathway into the webway. The Eldari had built this vast network of tunnels through the warp during the height of their civilization, allowing faster-than-light travel without the dangers of direct warp exposure. The Emperor intended to give humanity access to this network, freeing the species from dependence on navigators and the unpredictable nature of warp travel. The Golden Throne would serve as his psychic interface, allowing him to maintain and control the portal he was constructing beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. The Emperor spent decades modifying the ancient device, integrating technologies that blended the Dark Age artifact's original mechanisms with his own understanding of psychic phenomena and warp manipulation. He constructed an entire hidden facility beneath the palace, excavating through Terra's bedrock to create chambers that would house the webway portal and its supporting infrastructure. The scale of this construction dwarfed even the palace itself, with tunnels extending for kilometers in all directions and chambers large enough to accommodate armies. The project consumed vast resources and required the Emperor's personal attention for extended periods, time he could not spend leading the Great Crusade directly. Magnus the Red's psychic warning about Horus's betrayal shattered everything the Emperor had built. The Crimson King, desperate to alert his father about the War Master's corruption, used his immense psychic power to send a message directly to Terra. Magnus believed his abilities sufficient to penetrate any ward or barrier the Emperor might have established. He was correct, but the consequences proved catastrophic. The psychic wards protecting the webway portal were not merely defenses against intrusion, they were structural elements holding back the warp itself. When Magnus's message tore through them, he created a breach that opened directly into the Imperium. Demons poured through the gap immediately. The entities of the warp had been waiting for precisely such an opportunity, and they exploited it with terrifying efficiency. Within hours, the tunnels beneath the palace became a war zone as demonic hordes flooded into the carefully constructed webway passages. The Legio Custodes responded instantly, deploying into the tunnels to contain the breach. The Emperor himself abandoned his work elsewhere and raced to Terra, recognizing that the situation required his immediate intervention. He took his place upon the Golden Throne and began the psychic battle to seal the breach and hold back the demonic tide. For the remaining years of the Horus Heresy, the Emperor sat upon the throne, unable to leave his position without allowing demons to overwhelm Terra's defenses. He maintained a psychic barrier across the breach, while the custodians fought an endless war in the tunnels below, killing demons by the thousands while suffering losses that would have annihilated any other military force. The Emperor's absence from the wider heresy allowed Horus to consolidate his forces and plan the final assault on Terra without interference from the one being capable of stopping him through direct confrontation. The Webway Project, humanity's best hope for a future free from warp dependence, died in those tunnels, along with thousands of custodians and uncounted demons. When Rogel Dorn brought his father's broken body back to the palace after the confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the Golden Throne became a prison and life support system simultaneously. The device's original functions, serving as a psychic amplifier and control mechanism, remained intact, but now they sustained the Emperor's failing body rather than controlling the Webway portal. The throne channels the psychic energy drawn from the daily sacrifice of psychers, using it to keep the Emperor's biological processes functioning despite injuries that would kill any other being instantly. It also amplifies his psychic presence, allowing him to maintain the Astronomican and continue holding the Webway breach sealed even in his catastrophically damaged state. The Adeptus Mechanicus assumed responsibility for the throne's maintenance immediately after the Emperor's internment. The tech priests recognized that the device represented technology beyond their complete understanding, incorporating principles from the dark age of technology that had been lost during the Age of Strife. Their approach to maintenance followed the standard Mechanicus methodology, careful observation of the device's functions, meticulous documentation of every component and connection, and repairs performed according to established ritual rather than true comprehension. For the first several millennia, this approach proved sufficient. The throne's systems, while ancient and complex, remained stable enough that careful maintenance could address most problems as they arose. The deterioration began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Individual components would fail, requiring replacement or repair. The tech priests maintained vast stockpiles of spare parts, many salvaged from other Dark Age artifacts or painstakingly manufactured according to fragmentary templates. As centuries turned to millennia, however, the failures accelerated. Components that had functioned flawlessly for thousands of years began breaking down with increasing frequency. More critically, certain parts proved impossible to replace when they failed. The knowledge of how to manufacture them had been lost, and no existing examples could be found anywhere in the Imperium's territories. The tech priests began cannibalizing other ancient devices to keep the throne operational. Expeditions to Forge worlds and ancient human colonies sought out Dark Age technology that might contain compatible components. The Mechanicus stripped artifacts that would have been priceless treasures under any other circumstances, pulling out individual pieces that might serve as replacements for failing throne systems. This desperate scavenging bought time, but it could not continue indefinitely. The supply of compatible ancient technology was finite, and each passing century saw that supply dwindle further. By the 41st millennium, the situation had reached a critical state. The Fabricator General of Mars maintained constant communication with the tech priests stationed in the throne room, receiving hourly updates on the device's status. Failure rates for critical systems had increased by orders of magnitude compared to earlier millennia. Systems that once required maintenance every few decades now needed attention every few months or even weeks. The tech priests performed increasingly desperate repairs, bypassing failed components, rerouting power through alternate systems, and implementing temporary fixes that they knew could not last. Archmago's Dominus Belisarius Call approached the problem from a fundamentally different angle than his peers in the Mechanicus. While other tech priests treated the throne as a holy relic to be maintained, but never truly understood, Call studied it with the goal of genuine comprehension. His work on the Primaris Space Marines demonstrated his willingness to innovate rather than simply preserve, to experiment and advance rather than merely maintain existing knowledge. He applied the same philosophy to his secret research into the Golden Throne's mechanisms, research that many in the Mechanicus would consider heretical if they knew its full extent. Call's investigations revealed troubling information about the throne's fundamental design. The device was never intended for continuous operation over millennia. Its original creators, whoever they were, had built it for intermittent use, powerful activation periods followed by dormancy that would allow its systems to cool and reset. The Emperor's modifications had extended its capabilities, but even his genius could not completely overcome the limitations of the underlying technology. 10,000 years of constant operation had stressed every system beyond its design parameters. The throne was, quite literally, dying of exhaustion. The Archmagos identified several critical systems that would inevitably fail within a relatively short timeframe. The psychic amplification arrays showed signs of crystalline decay that could not be reversed with any known technique. The biological interface mechanisms that connected the Emperor's body to the throne systems were degrading, their organic components breaking down despite the preservative measures the tech priests had implemented. Most critically, the power distribution network that channeled energy from the sacrifice psychers to the Emperor showed increasing instability, with fluctuations that suggested catastrophic failure could occur with minimal warning. Call's proposed solutions ventured into territory that the Mechanicus officially forbade. He suggested that rather than continuing to repair the throne, the Mechanicus should consider building a replacement using modern understanding combined with recovered Dark Age knowledge. This approach would require innovation and experimentation on a massive scale, directly contradicting the cult Mechanicus's doctrine that all true knowledge came from the past, and that innovation represented dangerous deviation from the Omnissiah's will. The fabricator general rejected this proposal, though Kal suspected the rejection stemmed more from political considerations than technical objections. The Proteus Protocol represented another avenue of forbidden research that certain elements within the Mechanicus had pursued in absolute secrecy. References to this protocol appeared in heavily encrypted data cores recovered from Forge worlds that had been isolated since the Horus Heresy. The fragments suggested a Dark Age technology capable of transferring human consciousness from a failing body into a new vessel, whether biological, mechanical, or some hybrid of the two. The process supposedly preserved not just memories and personality, but the essential psychic signature that defined an individual's presence in the warp. If the Proteus Protocol actually existed and could be made functional, it might offer a solution to the Emperor's physical deterioration. His consciousness could theoretically be transferred from his current broken body into a new vessel, while maintaining the psychic connection necessary to power the Astronomican and hold the webway breach sealed. The technical challenges would be immense, creating a vessel capable of housing a consciousness of the Emperor's magnitude, ensuring the transfer process did not damage his psychic abilities, and maintaining continuity of function during the transfer to prevent even a momentary lapse in the Astronomican's operation. Any of these challenges might prove insurmountable, but the potential rewards justified investigation. The Mechanicus vaults on Mars contained technologies that had been sealed away for millennia, deemed too dangerous or too poorly understood for general use. Among these forbidden devices were several that related to human enhancement, consciousness manipulation, and biological reconstruction. The butcher's nails that Angron and his world eaters had implanted represented crude, barbaric versions of neural augmentation technology that had existed during the Dark Age. Properly understood and implemented, similar technologies might allow for the reconstruction of the Emperor's damaged neural tissues, potentially restoring functions that had been lost since his wounding. Genetic reconstruction technologies represented another category of forbidden knowledge. The Emperor's creation of the Primarchs had required manipulation of genetic material at levels that went far beyond anything the current Imperium could achieve. Kal's work on the Primaris Marines proved that some of this knowledge could be recovered and applied, but the Primarchs themselves represented a level of genetic engineering that incorporated warp-based elements alongside purely biological modifications. The Emperor had blended material science with immaterial manipulation in ways that no one else had successfully replicated. Some Mechanicus archives contained fragments of data related to these techniques, locked away because even studying them might constitute heresy. The timeline for the throne's complete failure varied depending on which tech priest's analysis one consulted. The most optimistic projections suggested centuries remained before catastrophic breakdown became inevitable. These estimates assumed that the current rate of deterioration would remain constant, and that the tech priests would continue finding ways to repair or bypass failing systems. More pessimistic analyses, including some of Kal's private calculations, suggested that total failure could occur within decades or even years. These projections factored in the accelerating nature of the deterioration and the dwindling supply of compatible replacement components. The consequences of the throne's failure would cascade across the entire Imperium within hours of the initial collapse. The Astronomican would extinguish immediately, plunging the galaxy into navigational darkness. Ships traveling through the warp would find themselves lost, unable to determine their position or plot courses to their destinations. The Imperium's military forces, scattered across 1 million worlds, would lose all ability to coordinate their movements. Trade routes that sustained entire sectors would collapse as merchant vessels could no longer safely traverse the distances between systems. Terra itself would face immediate existential threat from the webway breach. The Emperor's psychic might currently hold this portal sealed, preventing demonic entities from flooding into the tunnels beneath the palace. His death would release this barrier instantly. The custodians have fought in those tunnels for 10,000 years, maintaining a defensive perimeter around the breach, but they do so with the Emperor's power supporting them. Without that support, they would face a demonic incursion of unprecedented scale. The demons would not simply overwhelm the custodian defenders, they would pour through the breach in numbers sufficient to consume Terra entirely. The psychic shockwave from the Emperor's death would propagate through the warp like a supernova, felt by every psyker in the galaxy simultaneously. Astropaths would die by the thousands, their minds burned out by the psychic backlash. Sanctioned psykers serving with Imperial military forces would suffer seizures, madness, or death. Even non-psykers with latent abilities might experience the event as crushing headaches, nightmares, or temporary psychotic episodes. The warp itself would roil with unprecedented turbulence, making any form of warp travel suicidally dangerous for years or decades afterward. Terra would become the epicenter of a warp storm that would make the Great Rift seem localized by comparison. The concentration of psychic energy released by the Emperor's death, combined with the immediate breach opening beneath the palace, would tear reality apart across the entire Sol system. Every world humanity had colonized in its home system would find itself consumed by warp phenomena, their populations either killed outright or transformed into something no longer recognizably human. The cradle of humanity would become a demon world, a permanent wound in reality where the materium and immaterium merged into nightmare. The Adeptus Mechanicus understood these consequences with perfect clarity, which made their inability to prevent them all the more frustrating. The tech priests had spent 10,000 years maintaining the Golden Throne, pouring countless resources into keeping it functional, and they could see their efforts failing despite their best attempts. Some among the Mechanicus argued for revealing the full extent of the crisis to the wider Imperium, believing that only a coordinated effort involving all of humanity's resources might find a solution. Others insisted that such revelation would trigger panic and political chaos that would make the situation worse rather than better. Call's heretical research continued in secret, pursued in hidden laboratories scattered across multiple Forge worlds. He had spent millennia preparing for Guilliman's return, following instructions the Primarch had supposedly given him before his wounding. Whether similar preparations might be made for the Emperor remained unclear. The scale of the challenge differed by orders of magnitude. Restoring a Primarch was one thing, but restoring or replacing the Emperor involved problems that might genuinely prove unsolvable. Yet Call refused to accept impossibility as an answer, continuing his investigations into every potential avenue that might offer even the slightest hope of preventing the catastrophe he knew was coming. The Chaos Gods perceive the Emperor through a lens fundamentally different from any mortal perspective. To them, he represents the anathema, a being whose very existence contradicts their nature and threatens their dominion over the warp. The four ruinous powers have fought against the Emperor since before humanity's recorded history, recognizing in him a threat unlike any they had previously encountered. Where the Eldari gods fell to Slaanish's birth, and the ancient Necrontyr civilization rejected the warp entirely through their transformation into soulless machines, the Emperor represents something that actively opposes chaos while operating within the same psychic realm the dark gods inhabit. Khorne views the Emperor with a hatred that transcends even the blood god's usual rage. The master of mankind's vision for humanity involved order, discipline, and the suppression of the very emotions that feed the Chaos Gods. The imperial truth that the Emperor propagated during the Great Crusade explicitly denied the gods' existence, attempting to starve them of worship and belief. For Khorne, whose power derives from violence and bloodshed, the Emperor's attempt to channel humanity's martial nature into disciplined military action rather than berserk slaughter represented an existential insult. Yet the Blood God also recognizes the Emperor's growing power within the warp, the way 10,000 years of faith and worship have transformed him from a powerful psyker into something approaching true divinity. This transformation troubles Khorne because it follows patterns similar to the Chaos God's own existence, power derived from belief and emotional energy, consolidated into a semi-permanent presence within the Imperium. Tzeentch's relationship with the Emperor proves more complex and calculating. The architect of fate sees the Emperor as both enemy and fascinating subject of study. The Emperor's plans operate across timescales of millennia, incorporating layers of deception and misdirection that even Tzeentch finds worthy of attention. The Changer of Ways manipulated the scattering of the Primarchs, corrupted Magnus the Red despite the Crimson King's intentions to remain loyal, and engineered countless events that led to the Horus Heresy. Yet Tzeentch also recognizes that the Emperor's current state may serve purposes that align with the Chaos God's own interests. A galaxy locked in eternal stalemate, where the Imperium neither triumphs nor falls, provides infinite opportunities for schemes and plots. The Emperor's potential death and rebirth represents a nexus of possibility that Tzeentch monitors obsessively, seeing thousands of potential futures branching from that single event. Nurgle regards the Emperor with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. The Plague Lord embodies decay, entropy, and the inevitability of death, yet the Emperor has defied death for over 10,000 years. The Golden Throne sustains a body that should have died millennia ago, holding back the natural processes of decay through technology and psychic power. This defiance of Nurgle's fundamental nature offends the Plague God, yet he also sees the Emperor's current state as a slow victory. The Master of Mankind rots upon his throne, his body breaking down despite all efforts to preserve it. Nurgle can afford patience. Eventually, the Golden Throne will fail, and the Emperor's physical form will finally succumb to the decay it has resisted for so long. Whether the Emperor's consciousness survives this physical death concerns Nurgle less than the satisfaction of seeing even the anathema bow to entropy's inevitable triumph. Slaanesh, youngest of the Chaos Gods, views the Emperor through the lens of excess and sensation. The Prince of Pleasure recognizes that the Emperor's existence involves suffering on a scale that would satisfy even Slaanesh's appetite for extreme experience. 10,000 years of agony, the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers, the psychic battles fought continuously across the warp, all of this generates emotional and psychic energy that Slaanesh finds intoxicating. The Dark Prince also understands that the Emperor's potential rebirth would create a moment of transformation, so profound that it would generate psychic phenomena across the entire galaxy. Such an event would rival Slaanesh's own birth, which destroyed the Eldari civilization and created the Eye of Terror. The prospect of experiencing or influencing such a moment drives Slaanesh's interest in the Emperor's fate. The theory that the Chaos Gods deliberately prevent the Emperor's true death has gained traction among certain Inquisitors who study the nature of chaos and its relationship to the Imperium. The logic follows a brutal calculus. The Emperor's death would trigger his apotheosis, potentially creating a fifth Chaos God or an entity of equivalent power aligned with order rather than chaos. Such an entity would possess the accumulated faith of 10,000 years and the Emperor's own vast psychic might, unified into a conscious divine being capable of challenging the ruinous powers directly. The current situation, where the Emperor lingers in a state between life and death, prevents this apotheosis while simultaneously keeping the Imperium functional enough to continue existing as a source of souls, suffering, and emotional energy that feeds the Dark Gods. This theory suggests that chaos interventions throughout Imperial history have followed patterns designed to maintain the status quo rather than destroy the Imperium outright. The Black Crusades launched by Abaddon the Despoiler inflict tremendous damage, but never quite achieve total victory. Demon incursions devastate worlds, but rarely expand beyond containable limits before Imperial forces mount successful counterattacks. The Great Rift itself, while catastrophic, split the Imperium rather than destroying it entirely, creating two struggling halves that continue fighting rather than collapsing into complete anarchy. Each crisis pushes the Imperium to the brink without tipping it over the edge, maintaining the galaxy in a state of perpetual warfare that serves the Chaos God's interests. Abaddon the Despoiler's strategic objectives regarding Terra and the Golden Throne reflect this ambiguity. The Warmaster of Chaos has spent 10,000 years building his forces and launching Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror, each campaign striking at different strategic targets across the Imperium. His 13th Black Crusade achieved what 12 previous attempts had failed to accomplish: the destruction of Cadia and the creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum. This massive warp rift tore the galaxy in half, severing entire sectors from Terra's light and creating a permanent wound in reality that stretched across thousands of light years. The success demonstrated Abaddon's strategic brilliance and the power he had accumulated through millennia of preparation. Yet Abaddon did not march directly on Terra after Caedia's fall. The War Master possessed the momentum and forces to potentially strike at the throne world itself, but he instead dispersed his armies to consolidate control over the regions surrounding the Great Rift. This decision has prompted speculation about his true objectives. Does Abaddon actually seek the Emperor's destruction, or does he pursue some more complex goal that requires the Imperium's continued existence in a weakened state? The Despoiler serves chaos undivided, drawing power from all four ruinous powers rather than pledging himself to any single god. This independence gives him perspective that demon princes bound to individual gods lack, allowing him to pursue strategies that serve chaos as a whole rather than any particular aspect of it. The War Master's own statements about the Emperor, recorded by those who have survived encounters with him, reveal a hatred that goes beyond simple desire for destruction. Abaddon blames the Emperor for Horus's fate, for creating the Primarchs as tools rather than sons, for building an Imperium that was always doomed to fail due to its fundamental contradictions. Yet this hatred coexists with what might be interpreted as respect for the Emperor's power and the scope of his vision. Abaddon has spent 10 millennia proving himself worthy of the War Master title, building something that would eclipse even Horus's achievements during the heresy. Destroying the Emperor too quickly, before Abaddon has fully demonstrated his superiority, might feel like an incomplete victory. The question of whether chaos ultimately seeks the Emperor's destruction or transformation remains unresolved, because the chaos gods themselves may not agree on the answer. Khorne likely desires the Emperor's complete annihilation, viewing anything less as an insult to the blood god's martial pride. Tzeentch probably prefers maintaining the current ambiguity, where multiple futures remain possible, and the Emperor's fate serves as a nexus for countless schemes. Nurgle would accept either outcome as long as decay and entropy ultimately triumph. Slaanesh craves the intensity of experience that either the Emperor's death or rebirth would generate, caring less about the specific outcome than the sensations it produces. This lack of unified purpose among the Chaos gods creates opportunities for the Imperium's survival that would not exist if the ruinous powers coordinated their efforts perfectly. The gods compete with each other as much as they oppose the Emperor, their demon servants fighting amongst themselves even during incursions into real space. The great game that the Chaos gods play against each other in the Warp consumes vast amounts of their attention and power, preventing them from focusing their full might against the Imperium. The Emperor's existence as a common enemy provides one of the few points where the gods' interests align, yet even this shared opposition fails to produce complete cooperation. Prophecies and visions from chaos sorcerers paint contradictory pictures of the Emperor's potential futures. These psychers, who have bargained away their souls for knowledge and power, claim to perceive possible timelines branching from the present moment. Some visions show the Emperor dying upon the Golden Throne, his soul fragmenting into countless pieces that scatter across the Warp, creating a psychic catastrophe that births new demon princes from the fragments of divine consciousness. Other visions depict his apotheosis into a true god of order, a being of light and purpose who leads humanity in a renewed crusade against chaos. Still others suggest transformations more disturbing, the Emperor corrupted by 10,000 years of worship into something that resembles a chaos god in all but name, a deity of tyranny and suffering who demands endless sacrifice from his followers. The accuracy of these visions remains questionable. The Warp does not operate according to linear time, and precognition involves perceiving possibilities rather than certainties. Tzeentch deliberately seeds false visions among psychers to advance his schemes, making it impossible to determine which prophecies reflect genuine futures and which serve as manipulation. Yet the sheer volume and consistency of certain themes across multiple independent sources suggests that some visions contain truth. The Emperor's fate appears to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, where multiple contradictory outcomes remain possible until the moment of the Golden Throne's failure collapses the probability wave into a single reality. Magnus, the Red's knowledge of his father's condition exceeds that of any other being save perhaps the Emperor himself. The demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns retains memories from before his fall to Tzeentch, including conversations with the Emperor about the nature of the warp and the dangers of chaos. Magnus understands the Emperor's original plans for humanity better than most, having been intended as a key component of the Webway project before his catastrophic mistake shattered those plans. His current existence as a demon prince bound to Tzeentch gives him perspectives on the warp that transcend mortal understanding, allowing him to perceive the Emperor's presence within the Imperium with clarity that would destroy unprotected human minds. The Crimson King's relationship with his father remains deeply conflicted. Magnus believed he was trying to save the Emperor by sending his psychic warning about Horus's betrayal, only to cause the disaster that trapped his father upon the Golden Throne. This guilt has haunted Magnus for 10 millennia, even after his transformation into a demon prince theoretically freed him from such mortal emotions. He has made several attempts to reach Terra and confront the Emperor directly, each time turned back by the custodians and the psychic wards protecting the throne world. These attempts might represent genuine desire for reconciliation, or they could serve Tzeentch's plans in ways that Magnus himself does not fully comprehend. Magnus has claimed in communications intercepted by the Inquisition that he perceives multiple versions of the Emperor existing simultaneously. One remains trapped upon the Golden Throne, suffering and dying slowly. Another fights endless battles in the warp, growing stronger through accumulated faith. A third exists in a state of fragmented consciousness, portions of his awareness scattered across different levels of reality. Magnus suggests that these are not metaphors but literal descriptions of the Emperor's current existence. He has become multiple entities simultaneously, each operating with some degree of independence while remaining connected through bonds of consciousness that transcend normal understanding. If Magnus's perception proves accurate, the Emperor's potential return might not involve a single unified being, but rather multiple aspects manifesting in different forms. The warrior god fighting in the warp might emerge as an entity of pure psychic power, unconcerned with the material galaxy. The consciousness bound to maintaining the Astronomican might manifest as a force of guidance and navigation, leading humanity without direct intervention. The fragments scattered across reality might coalesce into something entirely new, a being that combines aspects of the Emperor's original nature with characteristics derived from 10,000 years of worship and deification. Each version would represent a different possible future, in which one ultimately manifests might depend on circumstances at the moment of the Golden Throne's failure. The Chaos Gods monitor these possibilities obsessively, each seeking to influence the outcome in directions that serve their interests. Tzeentch works to ensure maximum uncertainty, maintaining multiple potential futures in sewer position for as long as possible. Khorne positions his forces to capitalize on the violence and bloodshed that would follow the Emperor's death, regardless of what form his rebirth might take. Nurgle spreads plagues and corruption throughout the Imperium, weakening it so that when the crisis comes, humanity will lack the strength to survive the transition. Slaanesh cultivates excess and depravity in Imperial society, ensuring that when the Emperor's control finally breaks, the resulting chaos will generate the intense emotions the Prince of Pleasure craves. The demon princes who serve the Chaos Gods pursue their own agendas within this larger framework. Mortarion leads the Death Guard in campaigns designed to spread Nurgle's plagues across Imperial space, weakening the populations that generate faith in the Emperor. Fulgrim and the Emperor's children seek out centers of Imperial culture and faith, corrupting them into monuments to excess that mock the Emperor's original vision. Angron and the World Eaters simply kill, generating the rage and violence that feeds Khorne while destabilizing Imperial worlds. Each demon Primarch understands that the Emperor's fate will determine the galaxy's future, and each works to ensure that future serves chaos rather than humanity. The strategic calculus from Chaos's perspective involves balancing immediate gains against long-term consequences. Every world the Imperium loses to Chaos represents a victory, but if the Imperium collapses entirely before the Emperor dies, his apotheosis might occur under circumstances that favor order over chaos. The ruinous powers need the Imperium to survive long enough for the Golden Throne to fail naturally, allowing the Emperor's death to occur in a controlled manner that prevents his successful rebirth as a unified god of order. This requires chaos forces to inflict enough damage to keep the Imperium weak and desperate, but not so much damage that the entire structure collapses prematurely. The Eldari understand death in ways that humanity cannot fully comprehend, and their experience with creating a god from accumulated souls provides the closest parallel to what might be happening with the Emperor's transformation within the warp. When Slaanesh was born from the Eldari civilization's descent into depravity, the newborn Chaos God consumed the souls of nearly every Eldari in the galaxy, pulling them into the warp to feed its endless hunger. The survivors developed the Infinity Circuit technology, a psychic matrix woven throughout each craft world that captures the souls of dead Eldari and preserves them from Slaanesh's grasp. These circuits contain billions of souls, their psychic energy accumulated over 10,000 years of careful preservation. Ennead, the god of the dead, gestates within these infinity circuits. The Eldari seers prophesied that when enough souls had been gathered, when the circuits held sufficient psychic mass, a new god would be born from this accumulated death. This entity would possess the power to challenge Slaanesh directly, potentially destroying the Chaos God and freeing the Eldari from the eternal damnation that awaits their souls. The theory behind Ennead's creation mirrors certain aspects of what the Emperor might be experiencing. Both involve the accumulation of psychic energy over millennia, the concentration of countless souls, or the faith generated by countless worshippers, building toward a critical mass that could trigger apotheosis into true godhood. The differences between the two processes prove as significant as the similarities. The Infinity Circuits preserve Eldari souls in a state of suspended consciousness, maintaining their individual identities while linking them into a Gestalt network. The Emperor's situation involves the faith of living humans rather than the souls of the dead, though the daily sacrifice of psychers to sustain the Golden Throne adds a component of death and soul consumption that makes the parallel more direct. The Eldari planned Ennead's creation deliberately, engineering the Infinity Circuits specifically to serve as the god's womb. The Emperor's transformation into something approaching divinity happened organically, driven by the worship of quadrillions of faithful humans rather than any conscious design. The Inari faction emerged when Ivrain, an Eldari who had died and returned to life through Ennead's power, began gathering followers who believed the god could be awakened without waiting for every Eldari to die. This radical departure from traditional craftworld doctrine suggested that sufficient psychic trauma, or the right ritual circumstances, could trigger Ennead's birth prematurely. The fall of Cadia and the opening of the Great Rift provided exactly such circumstances. The massive psychic shockwave that accompanied the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum resonated through the Infinity Circuits across multiple craftworlds, and Ennead stirred from its gestation. The awakening proved partial rather than complete. Ennead emerged as a conscious entity with genuine divine power, capable of granting abilities to its followers and manifesting within the material realm through chosen avatars. Yet the god remained incomplete, lacking the full strength it would possess if the original plan had reached fruition. This partial awakening created a being of tremendous power that nonetheless fell short of what would be necessary to destroy Slaanesh outright. The Inari believe that further awakenings are possible, that Ennead can grow stronger through additional accumulation of Eldari souls, or through specific acts of power that feed the god's development. Ivrain's role in Robute Guilliman's resurrection demonstrated that the Inari possessed knowledge and capabilities that transcended normal understanding of life and death. The crone sword she wielded channeled Ennead's power to reverse damage that had persisted for 10,000 years, burning away the poison that prevented the Primarch's wound from healing and restarting biological processes that had been frozen in stasis. The ritual required precise understanding of how psychic energy interacts with physical matter, how divine power can be focused and directed to achieve specific effects rather than simply unleashing raw destruction. The willingness of the Inari to ally with humanity, demonstrated through their critical role in saving Guilliman, suggests they recognize common interests that override the traditional Eldari contempt for the younger race. The Eldari have watched humanity's development with a mixture of concern and calculation, seeing in the Imperium both a potential ally against chaos and a dangerous force that could threaten the galaxy if left unchecked. The Emperor's original plans during the Great Crusade included eventual conflict with the Eldari once humanity had secured its position among the stars. The Xenos would have been driven from their remaining territories or destroyed, their craft worlds shattered, and their exodite worlds conquered. The current situation has forced both species to reconsider such absolute positions. The Great Rift threatens Eldari and human territories equally. Chaos forces assault craft worlds with the same ferocity they bring to Imperial worlds. The Tyranid Hive fleets consume everything in their path without distinguishing between species. The Necrons awaken from their millennia long sleep and begin reclaiming the galaxy they once ruled, viewing both Eldari and humans as equally insignificant vermin infesting their former domains. Against such threats, the ancient enmity between humanity and the Eldari becomes a luxury neither species can afford. Eldred Ulthrin, the most powerful Farseer of Craftworld Ulthwi, has manipulated events across millennia with the goal of ensuring the Eldari's survival. His visions of possible futures have guided countless interventions into human affairs, sometimes aiding the Imperium and sometimes working against it depending on which outcome served the Eldari's long-term interests. Eldred perceives the Emperor's fate as inextricably linked to the Eldari's own survival. His prophecies suggest that the Emperor's death and potential rebirth will trigger events that determine whether either species survives the coming conflicts. The Farseer's visions of the Rana Dandra, the final battle prophesied in Eldari mythology, show the Emperor's presence as a critical variable. This apocalyptic conflict supposedly represents the last confrontation between the Eldari and Chaos, a battle that will determine the ultimate fate of the species. Traditional interpretations suggested this would involve Ennead's final awakening and the gods' confrontation with Slaanesh. More recent visions perceived by Eldred and other Farseers indicate something more complex, a multi-sided conflict where humanity's role proves as significant as the Eldari's own. Some visions show the Emperor reborn as a god of order, standing alongside Ennead in opposition to the Chaos gods. Others depict the Emperor's failed resurrection, leading to humanity's collapse, which in turn allows Chaos to overwhelm the weakened Eldari resistance. Still others suggest transformations more disturbing, where the Emperor's rebirth goes wrong in ways that create new threats rivaling Chaos itself. The consistency across these visions involves the Emperor's central importance to outcomes that extend far beyond humanity alone. The webway's significance connects directly to both species' survival and the Emperor's original plans for humanity's future. The Eldari built this vast network of tunnels through the warp during the height of their civilization, before the fall. The webway exists partially within the warp, but remains separated from it by sophisticated barriers that prevent demonic intrusion while allowing faster-than-light travel. The network spans the entire galaxy, connecting countless worlds and allowing the Eldari to maintain their far-flung empire without the dangers of direct warp exposure that plague human navigation. The Emperor's Webway project aimed to give humanity access to this network, either through creating new tunnels that connected to the existing Eldari infrastructure, or by seizing control of sections the Eldari no longer actively defended. Success would have freed humanity from dependence on navigators and eliminated the risks of warp travel that claimed countless ships every year. More significantly, it would have allowed the Emperor to relocate humanity's essential functions away from real space entirely. The Imperium's government could operate from within the webway, protected from demonic assault and able to coordinate across the galaxy without the communication delays that plagued the current system. Magnus the Red's catastrophic mistake destroyed these plans when his psychic warning shattered the wards protecting the Emperor's experimental portal beneath the Imperial Palace. The resulting breach allowed demons to flood into the carefully constructed tunnels, forcing the Emperor to abandon his other work and take his place upon the Golden Throne to hold back the demonic tide. For 10,000 years, this breach has remained open, sealed only by the Emperor's continuous psychic effort. The custodians fight an endless war in those tunnels, killing demons that continue probing for weaknesses in the Emperor's barriers. The Eldari possess knowledge about the webway's construction and maintenance that humanity lost before the Age of Strife. Their bonesingers can manipulate psychic energy to create or repair physical structures, working with materials that exist partially in both the material realm and the warp. This knowledge might prove applicable to the breach beneath the Imperial Palace. If the Eldari could be convinced to aid in sealing or repairing the damaged section of webway, it might remove one of the two critical functions that currently bind the Emperor to the Golden Throne. The political complications of such cooperation would be immense. The Adeptus Custodes guards the Emperor's palace with absolute dedication, and they view all Xenos as potential threats to their master. Allowing Eldari into the most sacred location in the Imperium, permitting them access to the tunnels directly beneath the Golden Throne itself, would require overcoming institutional resistance that has existed since the Imperium's founding. The Ecclesiarchy would denounce any such cooperation as heresy of the highest order. Multiple factions within the Inquisition would attempt to prevent or sabotage the effort, viewing it as unacceptable compromise with Xenos regardless of potential benefits. Yet the alternative involves accepting the Emperor's eventual death when the Golden Throne fails, which would release the webway breach anyway. The demons currently held back by the Emperor's power would flood through in numbers that would overwhelm any defense. Terra would become a demon world within days. If the Eldari could seal the breach before the throne's failure, it would eliminate one of the catastrophic consequences of the Emperor's death. His consciousness would no longer need to maintain the psychic barrier, holding the portal closed, potentially freeing that portion of his awareness to focus on other functions, or to consolidate with the rest of his fragmented being. The Inari's demonstrated willingness to work with humans provides a potential avenue for such cooperation. Ivrain has stated that the Eldari's survival and humanity's fate have become intertwined in ways that make traditional isolation impossible. The partial awakening of Ennead gives the Inari capabilities that other Eldari factions lack, including the ability to manipulate the boundaries between life and death in ways that might prove relevant to the Emperor's situation. If Ennead's power could heal a Primarch's 10,000-year-old wound, what might be possible if that same power were directed toward the Emperor himself? The theological implications trouble both species. The Eldari have never considered humanity's Emperor as anything approaching their own gods. To them, he represents a powerful psyker who achieved unusual longevity and strength, but nothing that compares to the entities that shaped the Eldari civilization during its height. The suggestion that he might be transforming into a genuine god through accumulated worship challenges Eldari assumptions about the nature of divinity and how gods come into being. If the Emperor can achieve apotheosis through faith alone, it suggests that the Eldari's careful planning around Ennead's creation might have been unnecessary, that sufficient worship could have created a god without requiring the infinity circuits at all. For humanity, the idea of accepting Eldari assistance with anything related to the Emperor contradicts fundamental principles that have guided the Imperium since its founding. The Emperor himself led the Great Crusade with the explicit goal of establishing humanity as the galaxy's dominant species, pushing aside or destroying all Xenos that stood in the way. Accepting help from the Eldari, particularly for something as sacred as the Emperor's restoration or the sealing of the webway breach, would require acknowledging that humanity cannot solve its most critical problems alone. Guilliman's return has created political space for such unprecedented cooperation. The Primarch's willingness to work with the Inari, demonstrated through their role in his resurrection, establishes precedent that other Imperial authorities can point to when justifying similar alliances. The Lord Commander of the Imperium has made pragmatic cooperation with Xenos more acceptable, though still deeply controversial. His authority provides cover for initiatives that would have been impossible before his awakening. The practical knowledge the Eldari possess about psychic manipulation and warp phenomena exceeds humanity's understanding in several crucial areas. Their farseers can perceive possible futures with clarity that human psychers cannot match. Their understanding of how souls interact with the warp, developed through 10,000 years of protecting their dead from Slaanesh, might provide insights applicable to the Emperor's fragmented consciousness. The techniques they use to maintain the infinity circuits, keeping billions of souls in a state of preserved consciousness while linking them into functional networks, could potentially inform efforts to consolidate the Emperor's scattered awareness. The Harlequins, the enigmatic Eldari who serve the laughing god Segorach, possess their own knowledge about the webway and the nature of gods. These warrior performers travel freely through the webway using their own hidden paths, and they maintain access to the Black Library, a repository of forbidden knowledge located within the webway itself. The Black Library contains information about chaos, the warp, and the nature of divinity that both species would find valuable. The Harlequins have occasionally shared such knowledge with outsiders when it served their gods' purposes, though their motives remain inscrutable, and their aid comes with prices that are not always immediately apparent. Segorach's own survival provides another data point relevant to understanding how gods can persist despite catastrophic damage to their followers. The Laughing God survived Slaaneish's birth when the other Eldari gods fell, preserving himself through cunning and misdirection rather than raw power. His continued existence, albeit in a diminished state compared to his pre-fall power, demonstrates that divine entities can endure circumstances that would destroy lesser beings. If the Emperor possesses similar capabilities, his consciousness might survive the Golden Throne's failure even if his physical body dies, persisting within the warp until circumstances allow for manifestation in new forms. The convergence of crises facing both species creates pressure for cooperation that transcends traditional enmities. The Great Rift has made travel and communication more difficult for both the Imperium and the Craftworlds. Chaos forces assault both species' territories with renewed vigor, empowered by the massive warp storms that rage across the galaxy. The Tyranids continue their relentless advance, consuming biomass without regard for whether it belongs to humans or Eldari. The awakening Necrons view both species as temporary infestations to be cleared away. Against such threats, the question becomes not whether humans and Eldari can afford to cooperate, but whether either species can afford not to. The Inquisition's pursuit of knowledge regarding the Emperor's true nature operates in the shadows of Imperial society, conducted by individuals who understand that certain truths pose dangers as great as any Xenos invasion or heretical cult. The Ordo Malleus, tasked with combating demonic threats, maintains the most extensive archives on this subject, though accessing these records requires clearances that even most Inquisitors never obtain. The Grey Knight's Fortress Monastery on Titan House's vaults containing interrogation records of demons captured and bound for questioning, and among these testimonies exist references to the Emperor that contradict official Imperial doctrine in disturbing ways. Demon interrogations present unique methodological challenges. The entities of the warp exist as manifestations of emotion and concept rather than physical beings with conventional biology. Their testimony cannot be trusted in any straightforward sense, as deception forms part of their fundamental nature. Yet patterns emerge across multiple independent interrogations, consistencies that suggest underlying truths even when filtered through layers of lies and misdirection. Demons refer to the Emperor with titles that translate roughly as the Anathema or the Abomination, terms that carry connotations of existential wrongness from the perspective of chaos entities. They describe his presence in the warp as a blazing golden light that burns their essence, a psychic fire that has grown stronger over the millennia rather than diminishing despite his physical body's deterioration. Several interrogation records preserved in the Ordo Malleus archives describe demon responses when questioned about what would happen if the Emperor died. The entities display reactions that Inquisitors trained in reading demonic behavior interpret as genuine fear mixed with anticipation. One particularly detailed interrogation of a keeper of secrets bound by Grey Knights in the 40th millennium produced testimony claiming that the Emperor's death would trigger a remaking that the Chaos Gods both desired and dreaded. The demon suggested that the Emperor's current state served Chaos's interests by keeping him trapped between existence and apotheosis, unable to consolidate his power into a unified divine consciousness that could challenge the ruinous powers directly. Another interrogation, this one of a Lord of Change captured during the defense of the Fenris system, yielded cryptic statements about the Golden One's many faces and the shattered mirror that reflects infinity. The demon claimed that what humans perceived as the Emperor actually represented multiple entities operating in coordination, fragments of a consciousness so vast that it could not exist as a unified whole within the constraints of real space. When pressed for clarification, the demon laughed and stated that even the architect of fate could not predict which fragment would dominate if the Emperor's physical anchor to reality finally broke. The Thorian faction within the Inquisition pursues perhaps the most radical interpretation of the Emperor's nature and potential return. Named after Sebastian Thor, the holy man who led the Imperium through the age of apostasy, and whom Thorians believe was possessed by the Emperor's divine essence, this philosophical school argues that the master of mankind's consciousness can inhabit mortal vessels. They point to historical instances of individuals demonstrating powers and knowledge far beyond normal human capacity, claiming these represent moments when the Emperor's awareness temporarily manifested through chosen hosts. The living saints venerated by the ecclesiarchy provide their most compelling evidence, as these individuals display abilities that seem to transcend what even the most powerful psychers can achieve. Saint Celestine's repeated resurrections and her ability to manifest with burning wings that allow flight represent phenomena the Thorians study obsessively. Her appearances during critical battles, arriving at moments when Imperial forces face imminent defeat and turning the tide through her presence alone, suggest coordination with some higher intelligence guiding her actions. The Thorians believe Celestine carries a fragment of the Emperor's divine essence, making her a prototype for what could be achieved on a larger scale. If the Emperor's consciousness could be transferred into a prepared vessel at the moment of his physical death, it might allow his return without the catastrophic consequences of the Golden Throne's failure. The practical challenges of implementing such a plan prove staggering. Identifying a vessel capable of containing even a fraction of the Emperor's power requires finding an individual whose psychic potential and physical resilience exceed anything that occurs naturally in the human population. The Primarchs themselves were specifically engineered to handle portions of the Emperor's genetic legacy, and even they could not contain his full essence. A normal human, no matter how powerful a psyker, would be destroyed instantly by the attempt. The Thorians have spent millennia searching for potential candidates, examining bloodlines descended from ancient heroes, studying individuals who display unusual resistance to chaos corruption, and investigating every reported miracle or manifestation of divine power. Their research has led them to controversial conclusions about the nature of the Emperor's original form. Some Thorian theorists propose that the being who walked among humanity during the Unification Wars and Great Crusade was itself a vessel, a physical form constructed to house a consciousness that existed primarily within the warp. This would explain why the Emperor's psychic presence has grown stronger even as his body deteriorates, as the physical form was always secondary to the true seat of his power. If this theory holds merit, creating a new vessel might prove more achievable than attempting to heal the catastrophic damage his current body has sustained. The theological conflicts this philosophy generates with orthodox imperial doctrine have made Thorians targets of suspicion from more conservative inquisitorial factions. The ecclesiarchy officially teaches that the Emperor exists as a singular, perfect being whose physical form upon the Golden Throne represents his actual body rather than merely a vessel. Suggesting otherwise implies that the object of humanity's worship might be something other than what 10,000 years of faith have proclaimed. The Thorians walk a dangerous line, pursuing research that many would consider heretical while maintaining sufficient political protection through their positions within the Inquisition to avoid outright condemnation. The Horusian faction represents the Inquisition's most controversial philosophical school, named after the arch-traitor himself in acknowledgement of their willingness to use chaos's own power against it. Horusians argue that the Emperor's restoration requires embracing methods that more Puritan inquisitors would reject as corruption. They study demonology not to banish warp entities, but to understand and potentially harness the mechanisms by which chaos operates. Their experiments with bound demons, chaos artifacts, and forbidden rituals have produced results that suggest possibilities for manipulating the Emperor's condition through applications of warpcraft that conventional Imperial psychers would never attempt. Inquisitor Zarenchek Xanthus, one of the most prominent Horusian theorists before his disappearance in the 41st millennium, left behind treatises arguing that the Emperor's confrontation with Horus had exposed him to chaos energies that remained within his essence. Xanthus proposed that these chaos-tainted elements could be isolated and extracted through carefully controlled rituals, potentially removing obstacles to the Emperor's natural healing processes. His experiments involved captured chaos sorcerers forced to examine psychic echoes from sites where the Emperor's power had manifested, attempting to identify signatures of chaos corruption within the golden light. The Horusian approach to the Emperor's potential restoration involves accelerating his transformation into a warp entity rather than attempting to preserve his physical form. They argue that the Emperor's human body represents a limitation rather than an asset, an anchor to mortality that prevents him from achieving his full potential as a god of order. Their research into apotheosis, drawn from studying how the chaos gods themselves came into being, suggests that a sufficient concentration of belief and psychic energy can transform a powerful consciousness into a genuine divine entity. The Emperor already possesses the accumulated faith of 10,000 years. What he lacks is the final catalyst that would complete the transformation. Some Horusian factions have proposed deliberately hastening the Golden Throne's failure under controlled circumstances, timing the Emperor's physical death to coincide with rituals designed to channel his departing consciousness into a prepared psychic matrix. This matrix would function similarly to the Eldari Infinity circuits, providing a temporary structure to hold the Emperor's essence while it consolidated into a unified divine form. The rituals would require sacrifices on a scale that would horrify even hardened inquisitors, potentially involving the psychic death of billions to generate sufficient warp energy to fuel the transformation. The Puritan inquisitorial factions view Horusian philosophy as barely distinguishable from outright heresy. The Ordo Hereticus has executed numerous inquisitors whose research into chaos-based solutions to the Emperor's condition crossed lines that more conservative authorities considered absolute. The political struggles within the Inquisition over these competing philosophies have occasionally erupted into violence, with radical and Puritan factions engaging in shadow wars fought through proxies and carefully orchestrated accidents. The Horusians survive through a combination of genuine results that demonstrate the potential value of their research and political alliances with powerful figures who recognize that desperate times may require desperate measures. The forbidden texts preserved in inquisitorial vaults provide fragments of information about the Emperor's nature and potential futures that official imperial history has suppressed or forgotten. The Lectitio Divinitatis exists in multiple versions, with the text attributed to Lorgar Aurelian representing only the most widely known iteration. Earlier drafts of the document, confiscated from word-bearers' archives after the heresy, contain passages that the ecclesiarchy has never acknowledged. These sections describe the Emperor's divinity in terms that suggest Lorgar understood his father was transforming into something beyond human even before the heresy began. The Primarch wrote about the Golden One's ascension and the price of godhood measured in suffering, phrases that take on disturbing significance when read in light of the Emperor's current state upon the Golden Throne. Other variations of the Lectitio Divinitatis emerged during the Age of Apostasy, when competing religious movements within the Imperium produced their own interpretations of the Emperor's divine nature. The Confederation of Light, a heretical sect that briefly controlled several sectors before being crushed by the ecclesiarchy, taught that the Emperor had deliberately orchestrated his own wounding to achieve apotheosis through suffering. Their version of the holy text contained elaborate theological arguments about the necessity of the emperor's physical death to complete his transformation into humanity's god. The Confederation's leadership claimed to possess prophecies describing the emperor's return, though whether these prophecies originated from genuine visions or represented fabrications designed to support their political ambitions remains unclear. Documents attributed to Malcador the Sigillite represent some of the most valuable and dangerous texts in the Inquisition's possession. The emperor's closest advisor and the first master of the Administratum left behind sealed records that were not to be opened except under specific circumstances. Several of these seals have been broken over the millennia, revealing contingency plans that Malcador prepared for scenarios, including the emperor's death or transformation. One document describes a protocol designated Terminus Decree, stored in the vault of the Grand Master of the Assassins on Terra. The nature of this protocol remains unknown to all but the highest authorities, though speculation suggests it involves some final action to be taken only when the Imperium faces absolute extinction. Malcador's writings reveal a perspective on the emperor that differs significantly from the divine figure the ecclesiarchy worships. The Sigillite referred to his master in terms that emphasized his humanity alongside his power, describing a being who made mistakes, felt doubt, and struggled with the weight of his responsibilities. These characterizations trouble those who encounter them, as they contradict the image of perfect divine wisdom that official doctrine promotes. Yet they also provide context for understanding the emperor's decisions during the Great Crusade and the mistakes that led to the heresy. If the emperor was fallible, if he could miscalculate and fail to anticipate his son's weaknesses, it suggests his current state might not represent some grand plan, but rather the consequences of errors compounded by catastrophic circumstances. Other fragments attributed to Malcador discuss the emperor's origins in terms that align with the shaman fusion theory, but include additional details. These texts describe the ritual that created the emperor as an act of desperation by individuals who foresaw humanity's psychic potential becoming a liability rather than an asset. The shamans supposedly recognized that the warp was changing, becoming more turbulent and dangerous as humanity's population grew, and their emotions fed the nascent chaos gods. The fusion that created the emperor was intended to produce a being powerful enough to guide humanity through the coming age of psychic awakening, someone who could teach humans to use their abilities safely while protecting them from warp predators. The text suggests the shamans knew their creation would be something other than human despite wearing human form. They accepted this necessity because the alternative involved humanity's extinction through psychic predation or self-destruction. Malcador's writings imply the emperor understood his own inhuman nature and struggled with it throughout his existence, attempting to guide humanity toward a future he could never fully share. This interpretation explains the cold, calculating approach that Guilliman and others have noted in their interactions with the emperor, not as a change resulting from 10,000 years of suffering, but as a fundamental aspect of what he has always been. Records of the Cabal's activities during the Horus Heresy, recovered from various sources including interrogations of captured Alpha Legion operatives, describe Zeno's perspectives on the Emperor that challenge Imperial assumptions. The Cabal, an organization of various alien species united in opposition to chaos, studied the Emperor as a phenomenon relevant to their own survival. Their analysis suggested the Emperor represented a naturally occurring defense mechanism, a psychic antibody that human evolution produced in response to chaos's threat. This interpretation frames the Emperor not as a unique individual, but as an example of a pattern that might occur in other psychic species facing similar threats. The Cabal's prophecies about the Horus Heresy's outcome included scenarios where the Emperor died and humanity fell to chaos, which the Xenos organization believed would ultimately starve the Chaos Gods by eliminating their primary source of emotional energy. They also described outcomes where the Emperor survived in his current state, maintaining the Imperium in perpetual struggle that fed chaos indefinitely. The prophecies suggested no scenario where the Emperor genuinely won, where he restored his power and led humanity to triumph over chaos. This pessimistic assessment troubled those inquisitors who encountered it, as it implied the Imperium's current course led inevitably toward slow extinction, regardless of how long the Golden Throne continued functioning. The Black Library, maintained by the Harlequins within the webway, supposedly contains texts about the Emperor that neither the Imperium nor the Eldari have shared openly. Inquisitors who have negotiated access to portions of the library report encountering references to the Emperor in Eldari historical records dating back to before humanity's development of interstellar travel. These records describe observations of an unusually powerful human psyker who appeared in various guises throughout human history, suggesting the Eldari had tracked the Emperor's activities for millennia before the Great Crusade. The Eldari perspective characterized him as a potential threat to be monitored, a being whose growing power might eventually challenge their own dominance if left unchecked. Prophecies recorded in the Black Library describe multiple possible futures for the Emperor, consistent with what other sources suggest about the uncertainty surrounding his fate. Some prophecies align with the Star Child theory, describing a rebirth that produces a god of order powerful enough to challenge chaos directly. Others describe transformations that create something neither order nor chaos, a new form of warp entity that operates according to principles alien to both. The Harlequins who guard the library claim that Segorach himself has taken interest in the Emperor's fate, though the Laughing God's motivations remain inscrutable even to his own followers. The Inquisition's various factions continue their research despite the dangers inherent in studying subjects that touch on the Emperor's true nature. Each philosophical school pursues its own approach, seeking answers through methods that range from careful historical analysis to experimentation with forces that more conservative authorities would consider absolutely forbidden. The competition between these factions generates both progress and conflict, as different groups pursue contradictory theories about how the Emperor's restoration might be achieved or what form his return might take. The practical limitations on this research stem from the simple fact that the Emperor's condition remains unique in human experience. No precedent exists for a being of his power-sustaining damage of this magnitude while remaining technically alive for millennia. The Primarchs provide some reference points, as Guilliman's restoration demonstrated that even catastrophic injuries can be reversed given sufficient knowledge and power. Yet the Emperor's situation involves complications that go far beyond physical damage, incorporating psychic wounds that span multiple planes of reality and a consciousness that may have fragmented across different levels of existence. The question of whether the Inquisition's investigations will produce actionable results before the Golden Throne's failure remains unanswered. Some factions believe they are close to breakthroughs that could change everything, while others argue that 10,000 years of research has produced nothing but speculation and theories that cannot be tested without risking consequences that might prove worse than the Emperor's death. The political struggles within the Inquisition ensure that no single faction can implement its proposed solutions without facing opposition from rivals who believe different approaches offer better chances of success. The phenomenon of living saints represents one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that the Emperor's consciousness remains active and capable of projecting power beyond the confines of the Golden Throne. These individuals manifest abilities that transcend conventional Imperial psychers, appearing at critical moments throughout the Imperium's history to turn the tide of battles that would otherwise result in catastrophic defeat. Unlike sanctioned psychers who draw their power through trained manipulation of warp energies, living saints seem to channel something fundamentally different, a golden light that burns demons and inspires Imperial forces with supernatural fervor. The Ecclesiarchy venerates these individuals as direct manifestations of the Emperor's will, though the exact mechanism by which they receive their powers remains a subject of intense theological and psychic study. Saint Celestine stands as the most documented and frequently manifesting living saint in Imperial history. Her first recorded appearance occurred during the Age of Apostasy, when she led Imperial forces against the forces of the corrupt Ecclesiarch Goge Vander. Witnesses described her arrival on the battlefield wreathed in golden flames, wielding the ardent blade that burned with holy fire and wearing the armor of Saint Catherine that seemed to turn aside blows that should have killed her instantly. She demonstrated the ability to fly through the manifestation of burning wings that appeared to be composed of pure faith made tangible, and her presence alone caused nearby Imperial troops to fight with courage that bordered on fearlessness. What distinguishes Celestine from other Imperial heroes is her repeated resurrections. She has died in battle multiple times across the millennia, her body destroyed by overwhelming enemy fire or catastrophic wounds that would permanently kill any other being. Yet she returns, her form reconstituting through processes that appear similar to perpetual resurrection, but operate according to different principles. Witnesses to her resurrections describe golden light gathering at the site of her death, coalescing into her form over the course of hours or days. The process seems to require the faith of nearby Imperial forces, as though their belief in the Emperor's power provides the psychic energy necessary to fuel her return. Her appearances follow patterns that suggest conscious direction rather than random manifestation. Celestine arrives at battles where Imperial forces face imminent defeat against chaos incursions, appearing precisely when her intervention will prove most decisive. During the 13th Black Crusade in the defense of Cadia, she manifested alongside her Gemini Superia, two companion saints who fight at her side and seem to share portions of her power. The three of them held critical defensive positions against overwhelming chaos forces, buying time for Imperial evacuations and counterattacks. When Cadia finally fell and the planet broke apart, Celestine led survivors through the chaos of the Great Rift's formation, her presence providing protection against warp phenomena that would have driven unprotected humans insane. Her journey with the Inari and her role in reaching Guilliman on Macragge demonstrated that her connection to the Emperor's will extends beyond simple battlefield intervention. She recognized the importance of the Primarch's return and worked alongside Xeno's forces despite the theological complications such cooperation created. This pragmatic approach to achieving the Emperor's goals, even through methods that contradicted Imperial doctrine, suggests that whatever intelligence guides her actions possesses strategic understanding that transcends rigid adherence to established rules. The Emperor himself had allied with Xenos during the Great Crusade when circumstances demanded it, and Celestine's willingness to do the same implies she channels his practical approach to warfare rather than the ecclesiarchy's more dogmatic interpretation of his will. The mechanism by which the Emperor's consciousness connects to living saints remains unclear to Imperial authorities who study such phenomena. The most prevalent theory among those inquisitors who investigate these matters suggests that the Emperor's fragmented awareness includes portions that can focus on specific individuals, temporarily channeling power through them to achieve particular objectives. The daily sacrifice of psychers to sustain the Golden Throne provides a constant flow of psychic energy that the Emperor might redirect toward manifesting living saints when circumstances require direct intervention. Each saint would represent a focused projection of his will, a fragment of divine consciousness given temporary physical form to act in the material realm. Alternative theories propose that living saints represent individuals whose faith in the Emperor has become so absolute that they create a direct connection to his presence within the warp, allowing them to channel his power without requiring his conscious direction. This interpretation suggests a more distributed model of the Emperor's divinity, where sufficiently faithful individuals can access portions of his strength through the intensity of their belief, rather than through any deliberate choice on his part. The accumulated faith of quadrillions of humans over 10 millennia has created a vast reservoir of psychic energy associated with the Emperor's presence in the warp, and living saints might simply be those rare individuals capable of tapping into this reservoir directly. The Legion of the Damned represents an even more mysterious manifestation of what many believe to be the Emperor's power, though their true nature remains subject to intense debate among those few Imperial authorities aware of their existence. These spectral space marines appear without warning at battles, where Imperial forces face overwhelming odds, fighting with silent efficiency before vanishing as suddenly as they arrived. Their armor burns with flames that do not consume, marked with imagery of skulls and bones that give them an appearance of death made manifest. They carry weapons that seem to exist partially in both the material realm and the warp, their bolter rounds striking with impacts that damage demonic entities as effectively as physical targets. Witnesses to Legion of the Damned interventions describe their arrival through walls of flame that appear from nowhere, disgorging the burning warriors who immediately engage the enemy without any apparent communication or coordination with Imperial forces present. They fight in complete silence, no vox chatter or verbal commands coordinating their actions, yet they operate with tactical precision that suggests unified purpose. Their targeting priorities focus on enemy commanders, psychers, and demonic entities, eliminating threats that pose the greatest danger to Imperial victory. After the battle concludes or the critical moment passes, they withdraw through the same flames that heralded their arrival, leaving no bodies or physical evidence of their presence beyond the enemy casualties they inflicted. The most prevalent theory regarding their identity connects them to the Fire Hawks chapter, a space marine force that disappeared in the warp during the 35th millennium while traveling to a war zone. The chapter's entire fleet vanished into a warp storm and was declared lost with all hands. Decades later, reports began surfacing of burning space marines appearing at desperate battles, their armor bearing iconography similar to the Fire Hawks, but transformed into the death imagery that now characterizes the Legion of the Damned. Whether these warriors represent the Fire Hawks' souls bound to eternal service, their physical forms transformed by prolonged warp exposure, or something else entirely remains unconfirmed. Alternative theories propose that the Legion of the Damned consists of loyalist space marines from various chapters who died in service to the Emperor, and whose souls he has bound to continue fighting beyond death. This interpretation frames them as the Emperor's own demonic servants, entities that exist within the warp but serve order rather than chaos. The comparison to demons troubles many who encounter it, as it suggests the Emperor operates according to principles similar to the Chaos Gods, binding souls to his service and manifesting them in the material realm to achieve his objectives. Yet the Legion's consistent appearance in defense of Imperial forces and their effectiveness against chaos entities suggests that whatever their nature, they serve humanity's interests rather than threatening them. The spectral nature of the Legion of the Damned indicates they exist primarily within the warp, manifesting in real space only temporarily when circumstances require their intervention. Their ability to appear anywhere in the galaxy without regard for physical distance or travel time suggests they move through the Imperium directly, emerging at locations where the barrier between Imperium and warp has been weakened by intense violence or psychic activity. Battles involving demonic incursions create precisely such conditions, which explains why the Legion appears most frequently during chaos invasions, where their unique capabilities prove most valuable. Their weapons' effectiveness against both physical and demonic targets implies they exist in a state that bridges both realms simultaneously. Standard bolter rounds pass through demons without causing lasting damage because the entities lack true physical form, but the Legion's ammunition strikes demonic essence directly while also impacting material targets with full force. This dual-nature weaponry suggests manufacturing processes or blessings that incorporate warp-based components, creating armaments that function according to principles that transcend purely physical mechanics. Whether the Emperor provides these weapons, or whether the Legion's transformation into their current state altered their equipment along with their bodies remains unknown. Documented cases of apparent divine intervention attributed directly to the Emperor extend beyond living saints and the Legion of the Damned to encompass a broader range of phenomena that suggest his consciousness remains aware of events throughout the galaxy. During the Plague Wars in Ultramar, multiple reports described golden light manifesting to burn away Nurgle's corruption from afflicted populations, cleansing diseases that the Imperium's medical technology could not treat. These manifestations occurred without any apparent human intermediary, the light simply appearing in locations where Death Guard forces had spread their plagues, reversing damage that should have been permanent. The Emperor's psychic confrontation with Horus during their final duel demonstrated capabilities that went beyond physical combat or conventional psychic attack. When the Emperor finally unleashed his full power against the corrupted War Master, he did not merely kill Horus's body, but annihilated his soul so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not preserve or resurrect it. This absolute destruction required the Emperor to strike simultaneously across multiple planes of reality, erasing Horus's existence from both the Materium and Immaterium in a single coordinated attack. The feat demonstrated understanding of how consciousness and soul interact across different levels of reality, knowledge that the Emperor apparently retains despite his current damaged state. His guidance of individuals through visions represents another form of intervention that occurs with sufficient frequency to establish clear patterns. Imperial commanders facing critical strategic decisions have reported dreams or waking visions that provide information they could not have obtained through conventional means. These visions often take the form of golden light that resolves into imagery showing enemy positions, weak points in defenses, or routes through dangerous territory. The recipients describe the experience as receiving knowledge directly rather than observing external imagery, as though information was being written into their consciousness by an outside intelligence. Navigators, the mutant humans whose third eye allows them to perceive the Astronomican and guide ships through the warp, report changes in the beacon's nature that suggest increasing complexity in how it functions. The Astronomican has always appeared to navigators as a golden light shining from Terra's location, but in recent centuries, some have described perceiving structure within the light, patterns that seem to convey meaning beyond simple directional guidance. These patterns shift and change, occasionally resolving into imagery that navigators interpret as warnings about warp hazards or suggestions for alternate routes. Whether this represents the Emperor's consciousness actively communicating through the Astronomican or some emergent property of the beacon's interaction with the warp remains debated. Protection of Imperial assets through phenomena that defy conventional explanation occurs frequently enough that some military commanders have come to rely on what they privately refer to as the Emperor's favor. Ships traveling through the warp sometimes emerge from journeys that should have resulted in their destruction, their navigators reporting that the Astronomican's light seemed to intensify at critical moments, burning away warp predators that had been pursuing them. Planets facing invasion by overwhelming forces occasionally experience sudden shifts in circumstances, with enemy fleets suffering catastrophic warp drive failures or critical supply ships arriving ahead of schedule despite astronomical improbabilities in their transit times. The increase in miracles, psychic phenomena, and reports of the Emperor's interventions following the creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum has been documented by multiple imperial organizations that track such events. The Adeptus Ministorum maintains records of verified miracles, cases where divine intervention provides the only rational explanation for observed outcomes. The rate of such verified miracles increased by measurable percentages in the years following the Great Rift's formation, with particularly dramatic spikes occurring in regions where the barrier between Materium and Immaterium had been weakened by warp storm activity. This correlation between increased warp instability and heightened manifestations of the Emperor's power suggests his consciousness operates more effectively when the boundaries between real space and the Immaterium become permeable. The Emperor exists simultaneously in both realms, his physical body trapped upon the Golden Throne, while his psychic presence battles within the warp. When the two realms draw closer together, as they have across vast regions of the galaxy since the Great Rift's creation, the Emperor's ability to project power from the Immaterium into the material realm apparently improves. This creates a paradoxical situation where the very warp storms that threaten the Imperium also enable the Emperor to intervene more directly in humanity's defense. The intensification of faith throughout the Imperium in response to the Great Rift's creation provides another mechanism that might explain the increase in miraculous phenomena. When the galaxy split and entire sectors found themselves cut off from Terra's light, populations across 1 million worlds turned to prayer with desperate fervor. The ecclesiarchy reported attendance at religious services increasing dramatically, with previously secular imperial citizens seeking comfort in faith as their material circumstances deteriorated. This surge in devotion generates psychic energy that flows into the warp, accumulating around the Emperor's presence and potentially providing him with additional power to fuel interventions in the material realm. The Astronomican's behavior during the period immediately following the Great Rift's formation demonstrated changes that suggested conscious adaptation rather than simple malfunction. The beacon flickered and dimmed across large portions of the galaxy, particularly in regions north of the rift where warp storms raged most intensely. Yet it never failed completely, and navigators reported that even when the light grew faint, it continued providing enough guidance to allow basic navigation. Some navigators described the experience as though the Astronomican was being deliberately throttled back in some regions while intensifying in others, as if the Emperor was consciously redistributing his available power to maintain coverage across as much of the galaxy as possible. The return of Robute Guilliman and his subsequent meeting with the Emperor in the throne room created ripples throughout the warp that psychers across the galaxy detected. The reunion of father and son generated a psychic pulse that manifested as golden light visible to those with the sensitivity to perceive such phenomena. This pulse seemed to carry emotional content that psychers interpreted as recognition, determination, and a cold assessment of the galaxy's current state. The Emperor's consciousness, whatever form it currently takes, clearly remains capable of responding to significant events and individuals, suggesting that reports of his awareness being entirely consumed by maintaining the Astronomican and sealing the webway breach underestimate his capabilities. The manifestation of what some witnesses describe as the Emperor's direct attention creates measurable effects on those who experience it. Space Marines who have fought in battles where living saints manifested report feeling a presence that transcended the saint's physical form, an awareness that seemed to observe and judge their actions. These warriors describe the experience as simultaneously inspiring and terrifying, feeling the weight of the Emperor's expectations pressing upon them while also receiving strength that allowed them to push beyond their normal limits. The psychological impact of believing the Emperor watches and judges creates tangible improvements in combat performance, though whether this results from genuine divine attention or simply from the power of belief remains impossible to determine definitively. Chaos forces respond to these manifestations with tactics that suggest they recognize the Emperor's interventions as genuine threats requiring specific countermeasures. Demon princes and chaos sorcerers have been observed attempting to disrupt living saints' manifestations through rituals designed to create warp turbulence that interferes with the connection between the saint and the Emperor's power. These efforts sometimes succeed in preventing a saint's appearance or weakening their abilities, indicating that the mechanism by which the Emperor projects power into the material realm can be blocked or degraded through sufficiently powerful warp manipulation. The accumulated evidence from 10,000 years of documented miracles, interventions, and manifestations paints a picture of an Emperor who remains far more active and aware than his physical state upon the Golden Throne might suggest. His consciousness operates across multiple levels of reality simultaneously, fighting battles in the warp while also maintaining the Astronomican, holding the webway breach sealed, and apparently retaining sufficient awareness to guide individuals, manifest living saints, and possibly direct the Legion of the Damned. Whether this represents a unified consciousness performing multiple tasks simultaneously or multiple fragments of his awareness operating with some degree of independence, the practical result demonstrates that the Emperor continues to influence events throughout the Imperium despite his catastrophic injuries. The question of whether these interventions will increase or decrease as the Golden Throne continues deteriorating remains subject to debate. Some theorists argue that as the Emperor's physical anchor to reality weakens, his consciousness will become more firmly rooted in the warp, potentially increasing his ability to manifest power directly. Others suggest that the throne's failure will disrupt whatever mechanisms currently allow him to maintain awareness of the material realm, potentially leaving him trapped within the Imperium and unable to perceive or influence events in real space. The uncertainty reflects the fundamental mystery surrounding the Emperor's current existence and the mechanisms by which he continues to affect the galaxy despite spending 10 millennia immobile upon the Golden Throne. The speculation surrounding the Emperor's potential return centers on several distinct scenarios, each carrying implications that would fundamentally reshape the Imperium and the galaxy itself. These possibilities emerge from analysis of his current condition, the mechanisms sustaining him, and the various forces that might influence his fate when the Golden Throne finally fails. The tech priests monitoring the throne's deterioration understand that complete failure represents not a question of if, but when, making these scenarios increasingly relevant to those few individuals with knowledge of the crisis. The catastrophic rebirth scenario envisions the Golden Throne systems suffering total collapse without warning or possibility of repair. The Emperor's physical body would die instantly as the mechanisms sustaining his biological functions ceased operation. The psychic shockwave from his death would propagate through the warp at speeds that transcend physical limitations, felt simultaneously by every psyker in the galaxy. On Terra, the immediate consequences would prove apocalyptic. The webway breach beneath the Imperial Palace would tear open completely, no longer held sealed by the Emperor's psychic might. Demons would flood through in numbers that would overwhelm even the Adeptus Custodes, who have maintained their vigil in those tunnels for 10 millennia. The palace itself would become the epicenter of a warp rift that would consume the entire Sol system within days. The Astronomican would extinguish in the same instant, plunging the galaxy into navigational darkness. Ships currently traveling through the warp would find themselves lost, their navigators suddenly blind without the beacon's guiding light. The Imperium's ability to coordinate military responses or maintain communication across interstellar distances would collapse immediately. Sectors would fragment into isolated clusters of systems, each forced to survive on local resources without support from central authority. The political structure that has governed humanity for 10,000 years would effectively cease to exist, replaced by countless regional powers struggling to maintain order within their limited spheres of influence. Yet this catastrophic death might trigger the Emperor's apotheosis rather than his destruction. The accumulated faith of 10,000 years has created a vast reservoir of psychic energy within the warp, all of it associated with the Emperor's presence and identity. At the moment of his physical death, this energy might coalesce around his departing consciousness, providing the raw power necessary to complete his transformation into a true god. The process would resemble how the Chaos Gods themselves came into being, consciousness and concept merging with sufficient psychic energy to create a semi-permanent entity within the Imperium. The Emperor would emerge as a god of order, a being whose power rivals the ruinous powers and whose consciousness operates according to principles that transcend his original human nature. This reborn Emperor would possess capabilities far exceeding what he demonstrated during the Great Crusade. As a warp entity rather than a physical being, he could manifest anywhere the barrier between Materium and Immaterium had been weakened, appearing on battlefields across the galaxy simultaneously through multiple avatars. His understanding of the warp's nature, combined with genuine divinity achieved through faith, would allow him to challenge the Chaos Gods directly within their own realm. The great game that the ruinous powers play among themselves would gain a fifth participant, one whose goals involve humanity's survival and the establishment of order rather than the perpetuation of chaos. The consequences for the Imperium would prove mixed at best. Terra's loss would eliminate the administrative center that has coordinated imperial governance since the Unification Wars. The Adeptus Terra, the High Lords, the countless bureaucratic organs that manage the Imperium's day-to-day functions, would all perish in the demonic incursion that consumed the throne world. Billions of humans would die, including many of the Imperium's most experienced administrators and military commanders. The custodians themselves might fall defending the palace, their 10,000-year vigil ending in a final battle against impossible odds. The loss of so much institutional knowledge and experienced leadership would cripple the Imperium's ability to respond to the crisis, even if the Emperor's divine rebirth succeeded. The survivors would find themselves serving a god whose nature might bear little resemblance to the Emperor they worshipped. Deification transforms consciousness in ways that make the resulting entity fundamentally different from its original form. The Chaos Gods possess distinct personalities and motivations, but they also represent vast, inhuman forces that exist on scales incomprehensible to mortal minds. The Emperor's transformation might follow similar patterns, creating a deity who embodies humanity's collective drive for survival and dominance, but who no longer thinks or feels in recognizably human ways. Guilliman's disturbing encounter with his father in the throne room suggests this transformation may have already begun, with 10,000 years of worship gradually eroding whatever human elements the Emperor once possessed. The gradual apotheosis scenario presents an alternative where the Emperor's transformation into divinity continues while he remains upon the Golden Throne, eventually reaching a threshold where his accumulated power allows him to transcend his physical limitations. This process would unfold over centuries or millennia rather than occurring in a single catastrophic moment. The faith of the Imperium's masses continues generating psychic energy that flows into the warp, strengthening the Emperor's presence within the Imperium even as his physical body deteriorates. At some point, this accumulated power might reach critical mass, allowing him to heal his injuries from within through the application of divine will rather than through any external intervention. The mechanism by which this healing might occur involves the Emperor's consciousness, gradually shifting its center of existence from his physical body to his warp presence. Currently, portions of his awareness remain bound to maintaining the Astronomican and sealing the webway breach, tasks that require connection to his physical form and the Golden Throne's amplification systems. As his divine nature strengthens, he might develop the ability to perform these functions through pure psychic power without requiring the throne's technological support. The daily sacrifice of psychers would become unnecessary, as his own strength proved sufficient to sustain the Astronomican independently. This scenario offers the advantage of avoiding the catastrophic consequences associated with the throne's sudden failure. Terra would remain intact, the webway breach would stay sealed, and the Astronomican would continue burning without interruption. The Emperor's physical body might heal gradually, regenerating from its current damaged state as his divine power flowed back into the material realm and reconstructed tissues that have been dead for millennia. Alternatively, he might abandon his physical form entirely, existing purely as a warp entity, while maintaining the ability to manifest avatars in real space when circumstances required direct intervention. The challenge is inherent in this scenario center on whether the Emperor possesses sufficient conscious control over his transformation to guide it in productive directions. If his awareness has fragmented, as some theories suggest, different portions of his consciousness might pursue contradictory goals. The fragment maintaining the Astronomican might resist any change that could disrupt the beacon's function. The portion fighting battles in the warp might consume all available power for combat against the Chaos Gods, leaving nothing for healing his physical form. The gradual nature of the transformation creates opportunities for things to go wrong incrementally rather than catastrophically, potentially resulting in an emperor who achieves partial divinity but remains trapped in a state between mortality and true godhood. The political implications of a gradually transforming emperor would prove complex for the Imperium's existing power structures. The High Lords of Terra derive their authority from governing in the Emperor's name during his incapacitation. If he began demonstrating increasing awareness and capability, questions would arise about when he should resume direct governance. The ecclesiarchy would face theological challenges, reconciling their doctrine of the Emperor's perfect divinity with evidence of his ongoing transformation. Different factions would interpret signs of his increasing power according to their own interests, potentially triggering conflicts over what his transformation meant for the Imperium's future direction. The technological resurrection scenario envisions a coalition of Imperial forces discovering or developing methods to heal or replace the Emperor's body through advanced technology rather than relying on psychic transformation. Belisarius Call's work on the Primaris Space Marines demonstrated that genetic engineering techniques approaching the Emperor's original capabilities could be recovered and applied. His heretical research into the Golden Throne's mechanisms has produced understanding of how the device functions that exceeds what other tech priests possess. If Call could be given unrestricted access to the Emperor's body and the throne systems, along with sufficient resources and time, he might develop solutions that the Mechanicus's conservative approach has failed to achieve. The theoretical basis for technological resurrection draws from multiple sources. The Emperor's original creation of the Primarchs required blending advanced genetic engineering with warp-based manipulation, producing beings who existed simultaneously as physical entities and psychic constructs. Call has demonstrated the ability to work with Primarch gene seed, refining and improving upon the original template. Applying similar techniques to the Emperor's own genetic material might allow for the construction of a new body capable of housing his consciousness. The Proteus Protocol, if it actually exists in functional form within sealed Mechanicus archives, could provide methods for transferring consciousness from one vessel to another while preserving psychic capabilities. The involvement of Xeno's allies, particularly the Inari, could prove critical to this scenario's success. Ivrain's use of the Crone Sword to heal Guilliman demonstrated that Eldari understanding of life, death, and resurrection exceeds human capabilities in certain crucial areas. The Inari's connection to Ennead gives them access to powers that operate on the boundary between existence and oblivion, potentially allowing them to stabilize the Emperor's consciousness during a transfer process that might otherwise destroy it. The political obstacles to such cooperation would prove immense, requiring Guilliman or another authority figure of equivalent stature to override objections from the Custodians, the Ecclesiarchy, and Puritan factions within the Inquisition. Dark Age technology recovered from newly discovered STC fragments or ancient human colonies could provide crucial components for constructing a new vessel. The Emperor's current body incorporates technologies and genetic modifications that predate the Age of Strife, techniques that have been lost for millennia. Finding intact examples of similar technology might allow tech priests to reverse engineer the principles involved and apply them to creating a replacement body. The Emperor's own perpetual nature, if it remains functional beneath his injuries, might facilitate the transfer process by providing a template that his consciousness could use to reconstitute itself in a new form. The practical challenges would test the limits of what the Imperium could achieve even with unlimited resources. The Emperor's consciousness exists simultaneously across multiple planes of reality, fighting in the warp while maintaining the Astronomican and sealing the webway breach. Coordinating a transfer that preserved all these functions without allowing even momentary lapses would require timing and precision that might prove impossible to achieve. The Astronomican's failure for even seconds could result in ships being lost throughout the galaxy. The webway breach opening for any length of time would allow demons to flood through, potentially overwhelming whatever defenses had been prepared. The question of whether a technologically resurrected emperor would retain his full capabilities and memories remains uncertain. Consciousness transfer technology, even at Dark Age levels of sophistication, might not perfectly preserve the psychic connections and warp-based aspects of his existence. The Emperor's power derives partially from his nature, as a composite being formed from thousands of merged souls, a configuration that might not survive transfer into a new vessel. The resulting entity might possess the Emperor's memories and knowledge, but lack the fundamental characteristics that made him capable of challenging the Chaos Gods and creating the Primarchs. The fragmented return scenario acknowledges the possibility that the Emperor's consciousness has already separated into distinct aspects that might manifest independently rather than reunifying into a single being. The warrior god fighting endless battles in the warp, the intelligence maintaining the Astronomican, the consciousness holding the webway breach sealed, and the divine presence that manifests through living saints might represent genuinely separate entities that share a common origin, but but have developed independent existence over 10 millennia. When the Golden Throne fails, these fragments might emerge separately, each manifesting according to its own nature and pursuing objectives that reflect its particular aspect of the Emperor's original being. The warrior aspect might manifest as an entity of pure martial power, a psychic titan that exists to combat chaos and destroy humanity's enemies. This fragment would possess all the Emperor's understanding of warfare and strategy, but might lack the political wisdom and long-term planning that characterized his rule during the Great Crusade. It would fight with devastating effectiveness, but potentially without sufficient consideration for the broader consequences of its actions. Imperial forces might find themselves led by a war god who achieves victory after victory, while the Imperium civilian infrastructure collapses from lack of coordinated governance. The aspect focused on wisdom and knowledge might manifest as a guiding intelligence that communicates through visions, prophecies, and subtle manipulations rather than direct intervention. This fragment would understand the Emperor's original plans for humanity and work to achieve them through indirect means, but it would lack the power to enforce its will through military force. It might provide invaluable strategic guidance to Imperial commanders while being unable to protect them from the enemies they face. The disconnect between knowing what needs to be done and possessing the capability to accomplish it could prove as frustrating as the Emperor's current incapacitation. The psychic aspect maintaining the Astronomican might emerge as a beacon entity that exists purely to guide humanity through the warp, a living lighthouse with no other purpose or awareness. This fragment would continue performing the function it has maintained for 10,000 years, but it would lack consciousness in any meaningful sense. Ships would still be able to navigate using its light, but the entity providing that light would be incapable of responding to changing circumstances or adapting its function to meet new challenges. It would represent the Emperor's duty made manifest, a being that exists only to serve without any capacity for independent thought or action. The divine presence that has been accumulating faith and worship might manifest as a god in the traditional sense, a warp entity that embodies humanity's collective belief in the Emperor's divinity. This aspect would possess tremendous power drawn from 10,000 years of prayer and devotion, but it might bear little resemblance to the Emperor's original personality or goals. Gods shaped by worship tend to reflect what their followers believe rather than what they actually are, and the Imperium's faith has transformed the Emperor from a secular leader who rejected religion into the central figure of the galaxy's largest organized faith. The resulting deity might pursue objectives that align with the ecclesiarchy's interpretation of the Emperor's will rather than his actual intentions. The question of whether these fragments could be reunified represents one of the most critical uncertainties in this scenario. If the aspects maintained some form of connection or shared awareness, it might prove possible to bring them together through ritual or technology, reconstituting the Emperor's original unified consciousness. The process would require understanding how the fragmentation occurred and what mechanisms might reverse it. The Eldari's experience with soul stones and infinity circuits might provide relevant knowledge, as their technology deals with preserving and manipulating consciousness that exists partially within the warp. The risk would involve attempting reunification and discovering that the fragments had diverged too far to merge successfully, potentially destroying all of them in the failed attempt. The identity question looms over any scenario involving the Emperor's return. 10,000 years of suffering, worship, and transformation have changed him in ways that might prove irreversible. The being who walked among humanity during the Unification Wars and Great Crusade no longer exists in that form, if he ever truly did. Guilliman's disturbing encounter in the throne room suggests the Emperor has become something fundamentally inhuman, whether through deification, fragmentation, or simply the accumulated weight of millennia spent in agony while fighting endless battles across multiple planes of reality. A returned Emperor might possess his memories and capabilities, but lack the essential characteristics that made him who he was. The purpose that would drive a returned Emperor remains equally uncertain. His original vision involved elevating humanity to dominance over the galaxy, eliminating the threat of chaos through the Webway Project and the Imperial Truth's denial of the gods' existence. Both plans failed catastrophically, and the Imperium that survived represents a grotesque perversion of everything he sought to achieve. Would a returned emperor attempt to restore his original vision, or would he adapt to the reality of what the Imperium has become? The faith that sustains him derives from worship he explicitly rejected during his mortal existence. Destroying the ecclesiarchy would eliminate a major source of his current power, yet allowing it to continue means accepting the deification he once opposed. The scenarios outlined here represent possibilities rather than predictions, potential futures that might emerge depending on countless variables that remain unknown. The Emperor's fate balances on the edge between divinity and dissolution, between apotheosis and annihilation. The Golden Throne's deterioration continues regardless of speculation about what might follow its failure. The Imperium races toward a crisis that will determine humanity's future, and the outcome depends on forces that operate beyond the understanding of even the wisest authorities who study these matters. What remains certain is that the Emperor's return, in whatever form it takes, would transform the galaxy as profoundly as his original emergence during humanity's ancient past. The Imperium would face a reckoning with the being it has worshipped for 10 millennia, discovering whether their god matches the faith they have invested in him. The Chaos Gods would confront a rival whose power might finally prove sufficient to challenge their dominion over the warp. The Eldari would witness the birth of a new god from a species they once dismissed as primitive and short-lived. Every faction, every species, every power in the galaxy would find their calculations disrupted by the return of the master of mankind, and the wars that would follow would determine whether humanity survives to see the 42nd millennium or perishes in the fires of transformation.